The wind in the Montana Territory did not merely blow, it scoured. It carried the grit of 1,000 miles of dry prairie, stripping the paint from the clapboard storefronts of Iron Creek and embedding itself into the skin of anyone foolish enough to walk outside without a brim pulled low. It was late in the year, the tail end of the 70s, and the season hung suspended between the dry, brittle autumn and the brutal, suffocating winter. The sky was a bruised purple, heavy with the threat of snow that never seemed to fall, dropping only dust and a biting cold that settled in the bones. Lucinda Hale stood in the narrow, steam-choked backyard of the boarding house, her hands submerged in a tub of gray, cooling water. A washboard, worn smooth by years of friction, leaned against her stomach. She scrubbed a miner's heavy canvas trousers against the ridges, the sound a rhythmic, wet rasping that grated against her ears. Her knuckles were raw, the skin split in jagged red lines from the harsh lye soap and the freezing temperatures. She was 24 years old, though the last 2 years had etched a weariness around her eyes that belonged to a woman twice her age, Mrs. Gable. The matron of the house stepped out onto the back porch, wiping her hands on a grease-stained apron. She was a woman built of sharp angles and sour moods, who viewed Lucy's widowhood not as a tragedy, but as a tedious inconvenience. "You are scrubbing that fabric as if you mean to tear a hole in it, Lucinda." "Mrs." Gable snapped, her voice cutting through the wind. "Mr. Henderson complained last week that his buttons were loose. If you ruin another pair, the cost comes out of your wages." "I will be careful," Lucy said, her voice quiet. She did not look up. She had learned that looking up only invited more scrutiny. "See that you do, Mrs." Gable muttered, turning back toward the warmth of the kitchen. "And be quick about it." "The sky is turning. I will not have wet linens cluttering up the parlor because you were too slow to beat the rain." The door slammed shut. Lucy stopped scrubbing for a moment, letting her hands sink to the bottom of the tub where the water was slightly warmer. She closed her eyes. Behind her eyelids, the gray light of the afternoon vanished, replaced by the suffocating darkness of a tunnel. It had been 2 years since Thomas died. 2 years, 3 months, and 4 days. He had been a laughing man, strong and full of reckless hope, convinced that the Montana earth was waiting to make them rich. Lucy remembered the morning he died. It had been storming then, too, a violent, unseasonal tempest that shook the walls of their small cabin. She had been worried about the debts piling up at the general store, about the look on the grocer's face when he marked their credit line. "We need the money." "Tom," she had said, pouring his coffee. "Just one more shift." He had kissed her forehead, grabbing his pickaxe. "Don't you worry, Lucy. I will be back before the rain clears." He never came back. The earth had groaned, a deep, tectonic shifting that Lucy felt through the soles of her boots a mile away. The mine, owned by Caleb Ward, had collapsed. The official report said it was an act of nature, a tragic instability caused by the storm. But the men whispered about rotted timber supports and corners cut to save a few dollars. Thomas was buried under tons of rock and mud. There was no body to bury, no hand to hold one last time, just a hole in the ground and a silence that had never left her. A sudden crack of thunder rolled over the hills. Low and menacing, Lucy gasped, her hands jerking from the water, splashing suds onto her apron. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She gripped the rim of the washtub, breathing in shallow, ragged gasps. "It is just the weather," she told herself. "It is just air and heat and noise." But her body remembered the rumble of the earth, and for a moment, she could taste dust in her mouth. She forced herself to finish the laundry, hanging the heavy dripping clothes on the line as the wind whipped her skirts around her ankles. She had to hurry. She had to cook supper for the 6 men staying in the house, serve them, clean the plates, and then retreat to the tiny attic room that was the only home she had left. Walking through town later that afternoon to fetch a sack of flour, Lucy kept her head down. Iron Creek was a hard place, populated by men who had left their manners back in the States and women who guarded their social standing like wolves guarding a kill. "There goes the Hale woman," She heard a voice whisper as she passed the mercantile. "Bad luck, that one," another voice murmured. A woman replied this time. "Pretty face, but she carries a curse. You saw what happened to her husband. Dragged him down to the grave." "She did." "Hush," a man's voice chuckled, low and oily. "I wouldn't mind a bit of that bad luck. A woman like that needs a strong hand to gentle her." Lucy stared fixedly at the mud on her boots. She felt their eyes on her, the judgment of the women who thought her existence was an affront to decency, and the hungry, predatory stares of the men who saw a widow as unprotected property. She was the town's pariah in its obsession, caught in a purgatory between desire and despise. She purchased the flour, counting out the pennies with trembling fingers. The shopkeeper barely looked at her, sliding the sack across the counter with a dismissive grunt. When she returned to the boarding house, the parlor was warm and smelled of stale tobacco and beeswax. She hoped to slip into the kitchen unnoticed, but a figure rose from the velvet armchair near the hearth. "Good afternoon, Lucinda." The voice was smooth, cultured, and terrifying. Lucy froze, clutching the flour sack to her chest. Caleb Ward stood before her. He was a handsome man in the way a cliff face was handsome, sharp, imposing, and unyielding. He wore a suit of fine dark wool, a sharp contrast to the rough canvas and denim of the miners and cowboys who populated the town. He owned the mine where Thomas had died. He owned the bank that held the mortgage on the boarding house. He owned nearly everything in Iron Creek, and for the last 6 months, he had been trying to own her. "Mr. Ward," Lucy said, dipping her head. "I did not know you were visiting. I was checking on my investment," Caleb said, stepping closer. He smelled of expensive bay rum and cigars. "But I also came to check on you. Mrs. Gable tells me you have been working hard. Too hard, perhaps. I work to pay my way." "Sir," Caleb clicked his tongue, a sound of mock sympathy. "And yet, the ledger shows you are barely keeping up with the interest on your husband's debts." "The doctor's bills from the weeks before he died, the funeral costs. It is a heavy burden for such small shoulders." Lucy's grip on the flour sack tightened. Caleb had paid those bills without asking her, presenting the receipt later like a gift, though she knew it was a leash. "I will pay you back, Mr. Ward, every cent." Caleb reached out, his hand brushing a stray lock of hair from her forehead. Lucy flinched, but he did not pull away. His fingers were cool and dry. "There is no need for this struggle. Lucinda, you know my offer stands, a house of your own, servants to do this rough work so your hands can heal. You would be the most respected woman in the territory. A wife," she thought bitterly. "A trophy." She looked up at him, seeing the coldness in his pale blue eyes. There was no love there. There was only the look a rancher gave a prize mare he intended to break. "I am not ready to marry again," she said, her voice shaking. Caleb's smile did not reach his eyes. "Grief is proper, for a time. But 2 years is long enough. People are beginning to talk. Lucinda, they say you enjoy your freedom a little too much. They say a woman without a husband is a dangerous thing. I can stop the whispers. I can give you safety. Safety at the cost of her soul." She knew what people whispered about the mine, that Caleb had ignored the warnings. Marrying him would be sleeping in the bed of the man who killed her husband. "I have work to do. Mr. Ward," she whispered, stepping around him. He let her pass, but his voice followed her, dropping an octave, heavy with warning. "Think carefully. Lucinda, winter is coming. It is a cold season to be alone. And my patience, unlike my wealth, has limits." Lucy fled to the kitchen, her breath coming in short, terrified bursts. She set the flour down and leaned against the counter, shaking. She was trapped. If she refused him much longer, he would call in the debts. She would be thrown onto the street, and in a town like Iron Creek, a woman on the street had only one way to survive, a fate worse than death. But if she accepted, she would belong to him. Outside, the wind picked up, howling around the eaves of the house. The sky had turned a sickly green black. A storm was coming, a big one. The swinging doors of the Golden Nugget Saloon groaned as they were pushed open. A man stepped out of the gathering gloom and into the haze of smoke and sawdust. Eli Carter was not a man who drew attention to himself by being loud. He drew it by being still. He was tall and lean, his body honed by years of sleeping on hard ground and working cattle across the open range. His duster was coated in the pale dust of the trail, and his hat was pulled low, casting a shadow over his face. He walked to the bar, his spurs chiming softly with a dull, heavy clank. The bartender, a man with a handlebar mustache and a nervous twitch in his left eye, slid a glass toward him. "Whiskey," Eli said. His voice was gravel, unused to long conversations. The bartender poured the amber liquid. "You just get in. Looks like you rode through some dust." "Brought a herd up from the south," Eli answered, taking a sip. The whiskey burned. A welcome fire in his gut after days of cold rations. "Drop them at the railhead. Just passing through. Best keep moving if you can," the bartender advised, wiping a rag across the wood. "Storm's blowing in. Gonna be a mean one." Eli nodded but didn't reply. He turned his back to the bar, surveying the room. It was the usual crowd, miners washing away the taste of coal dust, cowboys gambling away their wages, and drifters looking for an easy mark. A long, jagged scar ran along Eli's jawline, a souvenir from a skirmish he didn't talk about. It gave him a perpetual look of grimace, though his face was mostly impassive. At a round table near the stove, 4 men were playing poker. Their voices were loud, fueled by cheap liquor. "I am telling you," one of them said, slamming a card down, "it is unnatural. Every time that woman walks by, the temperature drops 10 degrees. You are just spooked because she turned you down." "Jim," another man laughed. "Turned me down," the first man spat. "I wouldn't take her if she came with a gold mine. She is cursed. Widow Hale? More like Widow Hex." Eli's hand paused halfway to his mouth. He did not know who they were talking about, but the malice in the tone was familiar. It was the sound of weak men trying to make themselves feel big by tearing someone else down. "Ward will tame her," a third man said, raking in a pile of chips. "He has got the bit in her mouth already, just waiting to tighten the reins. I heard he bought up her debt. She does not have a choice. She will be warming his bed by Christmas, or she will be starving in the snow." "Serves her right," the first man grumbled. "Walking around with her nose in the air, too pretty for her own good. A woman like that needs to be broken." Eli set his glass down. The glass hit the wood with a sharp clack that was louder than he intended. His jaw tightened, the scar stretching white against his tanned skin. He had seen enough cruelty in the war, and enough of it on the frontier, to know the smell of it. He did not know this Widow Hale, but he knew men like these. They were coyotes, circling a wounded calf. He finished his drink in one swallow, the liquid burning a path down his throat. He had planned to stay the night, maybe get a hot meal and a bath, but the air in the saloon felt suddenly poisonous. He tossed a coin onto the bar. "Keep the change," he muttered. He walked out into the street. The wind hit him instantly, smelling of ozone and wet earth. The horses at the hitching rail were stamping nervously, their ears pinned back. The storm wasn't just coming, it was already clawing at the door. The boarding house kitchen was dim, lit only by the flickering light of a kerosene lamp. Lucy was kneading dough for biscuits, her movements mechanical. The rhythmic thump-squish of the dough was the only sound in the room until the back door opened. She spun around, a dusting of flour falling from her hands to the floor. Caleb Ward stepped inside, closing the door against the wind. The latch clicked with a sound like a gunshot. "Supper's not ready yet." "Mr. Ward," Lucy said, wiping her hands on her apron. Her heart began to race. He wasn't supposed to be back here. This was her workspace, her sanctuary. "I'm not hungry for biscuits," Caleb said softly. He moved across the room, his boots heavy on the floorboards. He stopped in front of her. The kitchen was small, and he seemed to fill all the available space. Lucy pressed her back against the counter, the edge of the wood digging into her spine. "I have been thinking, Lucinda," he said. "I do not like to wait. Uncertainty is bad for business, and it is bad for the heart. Please, Mr. Ward, I told you." He reached out and took her left hand. His grip was firm, Not painful yet, but unyielding. He rubbed his thumb over the ring finger, where a simple gold band still sat. Thomas's ring. Sunday. Caleb said. What? Sunday. After the service. You will stand with me on the church steps, and you will accept my proposal. Lucy tried to pull her hand away, but his fingers tightened like a vice. A sharp pain shot up her wrist. You are hurting me? She gasped. Caleb leaned in, his face inches from hers. His eyes were flat and hard. Do not make me angry. Lucinda, I have been patient. I have been generous. But if you force my hand, I will take everything. The roof over your head, the clothes on your back. I will see you begging in the mud, and then I will take you anyway. He squeezed her wrist harder, twisting it slightly. Lucy cried out, a small, broken sound. Sunday, he repeated. Do you understand? Yes, she whispered, tears stinging her eyes. Yes, he released her abruptly. He smoothed the lapels of his coat, the mask of civility sliding back into place. Good. I knew you would see reason. He turned and walked out of the kitchen, leaving Lucy leaning against the counter, clutching her bruised wrist to her chest. She stood there for a long time, listening to the wind rise outside. The first drops of rain began to hit the window pane, sounding like handfuls of gravel thrown against the glass. Sunday, she looked at the walls of the kitchen. They felt like they were closing in. She thought of Thomas, buried in the dark. She thought of the men in town with their leering eyes. She thought of Caleb's cold, dead touch. I cannot do it, she thought. I cannot let him own me. Panic rose in her throat, tasting of bile. She could not stay. If she stayed, she would die. Maybe not in body, but the part of her that was still Lucinda Hale, the part that remembered how to love and how to hope, would be snuffed out. She moved before she could talk herself out of it. She ran up the back stairs to her attic room. It was freezing cold. She grabbed her satchel, a worn leather bag that had been Thomas's. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely work the buckles. She packed blindly. A wool dress, heavy and drab but warm. 2 pairs of stockings. A loaf of bread she had saved from the morning. She went to the small bedside table and opened the drawer. Inside lay Thomas's Bible, the leather cover cracked and stained. She placed it in the bag. Next to it was a small tin box. She opened it to check the contents. A silver locket with a strand of her mother's hair and $4 in coins. It was all the money she had in the world. She shoved the tin into the bag and buckled it shut. She threw her heaviest cloak over her shoulders, fastening the clasp with trembling fingers. The storm was roaring now. Thunder shook the floorboards, and for a second, Lucy froze, her hands flying to her ears. The memory of the mine crash roared in her head, drowning out the wind. Move! A voice inside her screamed, Move or die! She forced herself to uncurl. She grabbed the bag and crept back down the stairs. The house was quiet. The men were in the dining room, waiting for the supper she would never cook. She slipped out the back door and into the stable. The air was chaotic, a swirling vortex of dust and freezing rain. The stable was dark and smelled of hay and manure. There were 3 horses. One belonged to Caleb, a massive black stallion. One was the boarding house's plow horse. The third was a mare named Bess, owned by the proprietor, an older gentle beast used for errands. Lucy moved to Bess's stall. I am sorry, girl, she whispered, her voice snatched away by the wind. I am so sorry, but I need you. She saddled the mare with clumsy haste, her fingers slipping on the leather straps. She didn't have a riding habit, just her skirts bunched up around her legs. She led the horse to the rear door of the stable, avoiding the main street. She mounted, gripping the reins. The wind slapped her face, stinging her cheeks. She kicked the mare's flanks, and they surged forward into the night. She did not know where she was going. West, maybe, or south toward the rail line. Anywhere that wasn't Iron Creek. Anywhere that wasn't Caleb Ward's cage. The town vanished behind her, swallowed by the dark. She was out on the open prairie now. The storm, unobstructed by buildings, hit her with the force of a physical blow. The rain was torrential, cold as ice water, soaking through her cloak in minutes. The sky tore open. A bolt of lightning, jagged and blindingly white, struck a lone cottonwood tree 100 yards to her left. The thunder that followed was instantaneous, a deafening crack that sounded like the world snapping in half. Bess screamed, a high-pitched sound of terror. The mare reared, twisting violently in the air. Lucy lost her stirrups. She grabbed for the saddle horn, her wet gloves slipping on the leather. "No!" she screamed. The horse came down hard and bucked, twisting sideways as she scrambled for footing on the slick, rocky trail. Lucy was thrown. She flew through the air for a terrifying, weightless second before the ground rushed up to meet her. She hit the earth with a bone-jarring thud. Her head slammed against a rock, and stars exploded behind her eyes, brighter than the lightning. She tumbled down the slope, her body battering against sagebrush and stones, until her leg twisted beneath her with a sickening pop. She came to rest at the bottom of a shallow ravine. The world was spinning, a nauseating carousel of black and gray. Rain lashed her face, filling her nose and mouth. She tried to sit up, but a scream tore from her throat as agony shot up her right ankle. She collapsed back into the mud. She could hear the frantic hoofbeats of the mare fading into the distance. "Come back," she whispered, but the wind swallowed her voice. She was alone. The cold was already seeping into her marrow, numbing her fingers and toes. Above her, the storm raged on. Indifferent to her pain, lightning flashed again, illuminating the desolate, empty landscape. There was no shelter. There was no help. She curled into a ball, clutching her mud-slicked cloak around her shivering body. Caleb had warned her. The town had warned her. She was bad luck. She was cursed. As her vision began to blur and the cold darkness crept in around the edges of her mind, Lucinda Hale closed her eyes. She thought of Thomas. She hoped, with a final, desperate pang of sorrow, that the earth would be kinder to her than it had been to him. "I am going to die here," she thought, the realization calm and absolute. "I am going to die, and no one will even know where to look." The rain beat down, washing away her tears as fast as they fell, burying her slowly in the mud of the Montana wilderness. The wind screaming across the Montana plains did not sound like wind anymore. It sounded like a living thing in pain, a chaotic chorus of howls that tore at the ears and rattled the teeth. The cattle drive had been pushing hard for the railhead, but the weather had turned with a vengeance that caught even the seasoned trail boss off guard. The sky had collapsed from a bruised purple into a churning, charcoal black, erasing the horizon line until the earth and the heavens were one solid wall of freezing sleet. Eli Carter rode a roan gelding that was fighting the bit, its head tossed low against the stinging wind. Beside him, the herd was a dark, shifting mass of anxiety. Cows bawled, the sound snatched away instantly by the gale. "Get them to the high ground." The trail boss, a craggy man named Silas, roared over the thunder. He pointed a gloved hand toward the jagged silhouette of the limestone hills to the west. "We cannot hold them on the flat. The creek is going to rise." Eli nodded, though he doubted Silas could see the movement. He spurred his horse, cutting away from the main body of the drive. His job was to sweep the flank, to catch the strays that were drifting dumbly toward the ravines where the flash floods would hit first. The cold was a physical weight. It pressed through his duster, through his flannel shirt, and settled deep in his chest. This was not just a storm. It was a killing frost riding on the back of a hurricane. As he crested a rocky rise, the lightning flared, a stark, blinding sheet of white fire that illuminated the prairie for a heartbeat. In that flash, the world was frozen in silver and black. He saw it then. 50 yards down the slope, near a cluster of wind-twisted sagebrush, a shape lay on the ground. It looked like a pile of discarded rags tangled in the mud. Nearby, a horse was thrashing, its leg caught or broken. He could not tell which in the dark. Eli blinked, wiping water from his eyes. Darkness swallowed the scene again. A ghost. He thought. The prairie was full of them, or so the old-timers said. Spirits of the lost, waiting for a fool to follow them into the dark. But then the lightning cracked again, and he saw the rags move. It was a hand, a pale, human hand reaching blindly into the sleet. Eli slammed his heels into the roan's flanks. The horse skidded on the wet shale, protesting, but Eli forced it down the slope. He did not think about the danger of the descent or the cattle he was leaving behind. The shape on the ground was too small, too fragile to be ignored. He reined in hard beside the fallen figure and vaulted out of the saddle before the horse had fully stopped. His boots sank into ankle-deep mud. He knelt, the water soaking instantly through the knees of his trousers. It was a woman. She was lying half-curled on her side, her face turned into the mud as if trying to hide from the sky. Her cloak was heavy with water, wrapped around her like a shroud. "Ma'am," Eli shouted, grabbing her shoulder. She did not respond. He turned her over gently. Her face was pale as milk, her lips blue and trembling violently. Her eyes were closed, her lashes matted against her cheeks. A dark bruise was blooming on her temple where she had struck a rock. Eli stripped off his glove and pressed his fingers to her neck. Her skin was like ice, but beneath the cold, there was a pulse, fluttering, weak and frantic. She murmured something, a sound so faint he had to lean his ear close to her lips to hear it. "Thomas," she whispered. "The rock. Move the rock." She was delirious. The cold had already gotten into her mind. Eli looked up at the storm. If he left her here to go for help, she would be dead in 20 minutes. The temperature was dropping fast, turning the rain into razor-sharp needles of ice. There was no time to get her back to town, and the cattle camp was miles behind them in the open. He remembered the line shack. It was an old trapper's cabin up in the limestone breaks, maybe 2 miles north. It was rough, but it had walls and a roof. He moved with the efficiency of a soldier. He checked her limbs quickly for breaks. Her ankle was swollen, twisting at a bad angle inside her boot, but her back seemed sound. "I'm going to lift you now," he said, though he knew she could not hear him. He scooped her up. She was dangerously light, a bundle of wet wool and hollow bones. Her head lolled against his chest, her forehead resting against the rough canvas of his duster. She smelled of rain and fear. Eli carried her to his horse. The roan danced sideways, spooked by the burden, but Eli held the animal steady with a low, growling command. He managed to hoist Lucy up, balancing her across the saddle for a moment before swinging up behind her. He pulled her upright, settling her across his lap, wrapping his left arm tightly around her waist to pin her against his chest. He looked toward her fallen horse. The mare had pulled itself up and was standing on 3 legs, shivering. It was lame, but not broken. He grabbed the trailing reins of the mare and tied them fast to his saddle horn. "Come on," he gritted out. They rode into the teeth of the storm. The wind hammered them from all sides, trying to tear the woman from his grip. Eli hunched forward, shielding her body with his own as much as he could. Every step the horse took was a battle against the mud and the gale. Lucy drifted in and out of consciousness against him. Once, she thrashed, gripping his coat with surprising strength. "The mine!" she cried out, her voice ragged. "The water is coming in." "Hush," Eli said, his mouth close to her ear. "I have got you. You are safe." She went limp again, her breathing hitching in shallow gasps. Eli checked her warmth constantly. His hand pressed against her side. She was shivering so hard it shook his own arm, a vibration that traveled through his body. It took an hour to reach the line shack, though it felt like a lifetime. The cabin sat in a small depression between 2 boulders, a squat structure of gray logs that looked like it had grown out of the earth. Eli pulled up, the horses blowing hard. He untied the mare and let the animals find what shelter they could in the lee of the rocks. He could not bring them inside. He carried Lucy to the door. It was swollen shut from the damp. He had to kick it, once, twice, before the wood gave way with a screech of rusted hinges. He stumbled inside, the wind trying to follow him in. He kicked the door shut behind him and looked around wildly. He spotted a heavy pine plank leaning against the wall and jammed it into the iron brackets across the door. barring it against the storm. The silence inside was sudden and shocking. The wind still howled, but it was muffled now, a distant rage rather than an immediate assault. The shack was pitch black. Eli could smell dust, old wood smoke, and the metallic tang of dry earth. He navigated by memory and touch, carrying Lucy to the single bunk built into the far wall. He laid her down on the mattress, which was little more than ticking stuffed with straw. She was shaking violently now, her teeth chattering with a sound that filled the small room. Hypothermia. He knew the signs. If he didn't get her warm immediately, her heart would simply stop. He fumbled in his pockets for a match, striking it against the rough wall. The flare of sulfur illuminated the space for a second. The rusted potbelly stove, the table with one crooked leg, the tiny window rattling in its frame. He located the kerosene lantern hanging on a nail and lit it. The yellow light pushed back the shadows, revealing the spider webs draped in the corners like gray lace. Eli turned back to the bunk. Lucy was pale as death, her lips a frightening shade of violet. Her clothes were sodden, clinging to her skin like a second, freezing layer. He took a breath, steeling himself. He was a man who lived by a strict code, and the idea of undressing a woman who was not his wife, a woman who was unconscious and defenseless, made his stomach turn with unease. But the wet clothes were killing her. Modesty would be a cold comfort in a grave. "Forgive me, ma'am," he whispered into the room. He worked quickly, his jaw set. He kept his eyes focused on her face or her hands, averting his gaze as he unbuttoned the heavy, soaked cloak and peeled it away. Then the bodice of her dress. The fabric was stiff with mud. His fingers, numb from the cold, fumbled with the small buttons, and he cursed silently at his own clumsiness. He stripped her down to her chemise and petticoats, which were damp but not soaked through like the outer layers. He did not let himself look at the curve of her shoulder or the swell of her breast. He treated her body with the clinical detachment of a field medic, checking her skin for frostbite as he worked. He found a stack of blankets in a wooden chest at the foot of the bed. They were coarse, scratchy wool that smelled of mothballs and cedar, but they were dry. He wrapped her in them, swaddling her tightly until only her face was visible. He then grabbed her hands, small, red, and cold, and rubbed them briskly between his own, trying to force friction and heat back into the skin. "Wake up," he said, his voice rough. "You need to wake up now." She moaned, her head turning on the pillow. Her eyelids fluttered open, revealing eyes that were dark and unfocused. "Thomas?" she croaked. "You came back." Eli paused, his thumbs still rubbing her knuckles. "No, ma'am, my name is Eli. You took a fall." She blinked, the confusion deepening. "Caleb?" she whispered, shrinking back against the mattress. "I told you, I cannot. Please do not touch me." The fear in her voice was sharp, cutting through her exhaustion. It wasn't the fear of the storm. It was the fear of a trapped animal facing a predator. Eli released her hands instantly and stepped back, holding his palms up in the yellow light. "I am not Caleb," he said, keeping his voice low and steady, the way he would speak to a spooked horse. "I am Eli Carter. I found you on the trail. You're in a line shack in the hills. You are safe." Lucy stared at him. Her vision cleared slowly. She saw the scar on his jaw, the rough stubble, the dark eyes that held concern rather than cruelty. She looked around the strange, shadowy room, hearing the wind tear at the roof. "I fell," she whispered. "The lightning. The horse spooked." "Yes," Eli said. "You are safe now. But you are freezing. I need to get the fire going." He turned away, giving her the privacy of his back. He knelt before the rusted stove. His hands were shaking, the adrenaline of the rescue beginning to fade, leaving him with the tremors of the cold. He shoved handfuls of dry grass and kindling into the iron belly of the stove. He broke a piece of old fence board over his knee and fed the splinters in. A match flared, smoke puffed out, acrid and gray, before the draft caught and the fire began to roar. Eli crouched there for a long time, feeding the flames, letting the heat seep into his own bones. He could feel Lucy watching him from the bunk, when the stove was glowing a dull red, radiating a small circle of warmth. Eli stood up. He dragged the three-legged table closer to the bunk and sat on it, keeping a respectful distance but close enough to monitor her. "How is the ankle?" he asked. Lucy shifted her leg beneath the wool blankets and winced. "It throbs," she said, "but I can move my toes." "That is good. Nothing is broken. Likely just a bad sprain." The silence stretched between them, filled only by the crackle of the wood and the screaming wind outside. The cabin was small, scarcely 10 feet across. The intimacy of the space was oppressive. There was nowhere to look but at each other. Lucy pulled the blanket tighter under her chin. Her face was returning to a more natural color, the violet fading from her lips. She looked young, terribly young, with her wet hair plastered to her forehead. "Why were you out there?" Eli asked quietly. "That is no weather for a ride." Lucy looked at the stove. The flames cast dancing shadows across her face. "I was leaving," she said. "Leaving town? In this? I had to." She said it with such finality that Eli frowned. He remembered the voices in the saloon, the crude jokes about the widow Hex and Caleb Ward's taming. "Was someone chasing you?" he asked. "Not chasing," she said, her voice trembling. "Cornering." She looked up at him then, and her eyes were full of a haunting, exhausted grief. "My husband died in the mine 2 years ago. Thomas. He died because we needed money, and I told him to work that shift. The storm came, and the earth just swallowed him." Eli nodded slowly. He did not interrupt. "Since then," Lucy continued, her voice gaining a little strength, "the town looks at me like I am a ghost that forgot to die. They say I am bad luck, and Caleb Ward." The name hung in the air like smoke. "He owns the mine," she said bitterly. "He owns the debt Thomas left behind. He told me he would forgive the debt if I married him. He made it sound like charity, like he was saving me. But his eyes, he looks at me like I'm a piece of land he needs to fence in." Eli watched her hands clutch the blanket. He saw the white knuckles. He saw the terror of a woman who had been stripped of her agency by men who saw power as a right. "He gave me a deadline," Lucy whispered. "Sunday. I could not stay. I would rather die in the storm than be his wife." Eli felt a cold anger coiling in his gut. It was a familiar feeling, one he had carried since the war, the anger at injustice, at the strong crushing the weak. "I heard men talking in the saloon," Eli said, his voice gravelly. "They spoke of you. They were fools." Lucy looked at him, surprised by the hardness in his tone. "And you? Who are you?" "Eli Carter. Why are you riding alone in a storm?" Eli looked down at his hands. They were scarred, rough hands that had held rifles and reins and shovels. "I ride for the brand, mostly." He said, "Just a hand moving cattle. But before that, I was a soldier. Union or Confederate? Does it matter now? We all bled the same color mud." He sighed, leaning forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "I saw too much of it. Death. After the surrender, I thought I could leave it behind. But trouble has a way of finding you." He touched the scar on his jaw unconsciously. "They say in town that I killed a man over a card game," he said. "That is the rumor that follows me." "Is it true?" Lucy asked. She did not sound afraid, only curious. "I killed a man," Eli admitted, meeting her gaze, "but it was not over cards. He was drunk. He had a woman cornered in the alley behind the saloon. She was screaming. He had a knife. I stepped in. He turned the knife on me." He shrugged, a heavy, weary motion. "I shot him. The law called it self-defense, but the town called it murder. It is easier to believe a drifter is a killer than to believe a local man was a monster. So I kept moving." Lucy watched him. She saw the weight he carried, the slouch of his shoulders that spoke of a man perpetually waiting for the next blow. "We are a pair, aren't we?" she said softly. "The widow who brings death and the soldier who deals it." Eli looked at her, and for the first time, a faint, rueful smile touched his lips. "I suppose we are." The wind outside gusted with sudden, violent force. The shack groaned, the timber complaining under the pressure. A slat in the window shutter splintered, and a spray of icy sleet hissed into the room. Landing on the stove with a sharp sizzle, Lucy gasped, flinching violently. She scrambled backward on the bunk, pressing herself into the corner. Her breath came in short, terrified pants. The sound, she gasped. It sounds like the rocks falling, like the mine. She was panicking. The small space, the noise, the trauma. It was all crashing down on her. She covered her ears, her eyes squeezed shut. Eli moved instantly. He crossed the small distance to the bunk and sat on the edge. He did not grab her. He simply placed a large, warm hand on her shoulder. "Lucy," he said firmly, "look at me." She shook her head, sobbing. "I can't be in the dark. I can't be buried again." "You are not buried," Eli said. "You are above ground. I am right here." She lunged forward, grabbing his arm. Her fingers dug into his sleeve, desperate for an anchor. "Don't let go," she begged, her voice rising to a wail. "Please, don't let go of me." Eli didn't hesitate. He pulled her toward him. He wrapped his arms around her blanket-swathed form, holding her tight against his chest. He could feel her trembling, a vibration that seemed to come from her very soul. "I have got you," he murmured into her hair. "I am not going anywhere." He held her while she wept, rocking her slightly. He felt the dampness of her hair against his neck, the warmth of her breath hitching against his collarbone. As the minutes passed, her sobbing subsided into quiet, exhausted hiccups. But she did not pull away. She stayed pressed against him, her head resting in the crook of his neck. Eli became acutely aware of her. He was a man who had been alone for a very long time. The feel of a woman in his arms, even one wrapped in wool and trauma, awoke a fierce, protective instinct in him. And beneath that, something else, a heat that had nothing to do with the stove. He could smell the faint scent of lavender soap on her skin, beneath the smell of rain. He could feel the curve of her spine under his hand. He kept his touch chaste, stroking her back in slow, reassuring circles, but his heart was hammering against his ribs. Lucy shifted, lifting her head. Her face was inches from his. In the dim firelight, her eyes were dark pools of vulnerability. "Thank you," she whispered, "for saving me." Eli swallowed hard. His throat felt dry. "I would not have left a dog out in that storm, ma'am. Certainly not you." She looked at his mouth, then up to his eyes. She was exhausted, battered, and stripped of everything she owned. But here, in this tiny, fire-lit box, with the storm screaming outside, she felt something she hadn't felt in 2 years. She felt seen. She felt alive. Caleb looked at her like a possession. The town looked at her like a curse. Eli looked at her like she was precious. She leaned in slightly. It was an unconscious movement, a moth drawn to a flame. Eli froze. He wanted to kiss her. The desire hit him with the force of a physical blow. He wanted to taste the rain on her skin, to sweep away the memory of the cold. But he knew he couldn't. She was vulnerable. She was scared. If he touched her now, he would be no better than the men she was running from. He pulled back, just an inch, a microscopic retreat that cost him everything to make. "You should sleep," he said, his voice husky. "The storm will break by morning." Lucy searched his face. She saw the desire there, warring with his honor. She respected him for the retreat, even as a part of her mourned it. She didn't want to let go. The darkness was waiting at the edges of the room. "Stay," she whispered. "Please, just sit with me. I don't want to be alone when the thunder comes." Eli looked at the single, narrow bunk. There was no chair. The floor was freezing drafts and dirt. He nodded slowly. He shifted, swinging his legs up onto the mattress. He sat with his back against the rough log wall, extending his legs alongside hers. He did not lie down fully. He remained a sentry, a guardian. Lucy settled back, curling into his side. She rested her head on his chest, her hand curling into the fabric of his shirt, right over his heart. A crack of thunder shook the cabin, vibrating through the floorboards. Lucy stiffened, a gasp catching in her throat. Eli's arm tightened around her instantly. "I am here," he said. He felt her relax by degrees, her breathing slowing as exhaustion finally claimed her. Eli stared at the ceiling shadows. He could feel the soft weight of her against him. He could feel the steady rhythm of her breathing. The storm raged on, tearing at the world outside, but inside the circle of his arms, there was a fragile, defiant peace. He kept his eyes open for a long time, listening to the wind and the woman, determined to hold back the dark for as long as it took. Eventually, his own head dropped, his cheek resting against the top of her head, and he drifted into a restless, vigilant sleep, his hand still firmly clasping her shoulder, refusing to let go. Dawn broke not with a burst of sunlight, but with a slow, creeping grayness that seeped through the cracks in the line shack's timber walls. The storm had exhausted itself in the night, leaving behind a silence so profound it felt heavy, broken only by the occasional drip of melting sleet from the eaves. The air inside the cabin was bitterly cold, the fire in the rusted stove having burned down to a pile of sullen, ash-covered coals hours ago. Lucy Hale drifted up from the depths of sleep, her mind foggy and disoriented. For a moment, she thought she was back in her own bed at the boarding house, shivering under her thin quilt, but the texture against her cheek was not cotton. It was rough, smelled of tobacco, wood smoke, and rain. It was flannel, and there was a warmth, a solid, radiating heat that pressed along the entire length of her side. She opened her eyes. The first thing she saw was a brass button. She blinked, her vision clearing, and realized her hand was bunched tightly in the fabric of a man's shirt, her knuckles white with the force of her grip. Her head was resting on a broad chest that rose and fell with a slow, steady rhythm. Memory crashed into her with the force of a physical blow. The storm, the fall, the stranger. She gasped, pushing herself backward. The movement was clumsy. Her injured ankle protested with a sharp, hot stab of pain that made her cry out. Eli Carter woke instantly. He did not startle or flinch. One moment he was asleep, and the next his eyes were open, alert and clear. He caught her by the shoulder before she could tumble off the narrow bunk. "Easy," he said, his voice rough with sleep. "Watch your leg." Lucy scrambled back against the log wall, pulling the scratchy wool blanket up to her chin. Her heart was hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The intimacy of their position, her body molded to his, her legs tangled with his, burned her with sudden, mortifying shame. She was a widow, a woman of reputation, however tattered, and she had spent the night clinging to a drifter she had met only hours before. "I am sorry," she stammered, her face flushing hot despite the freezing air. "I did not mean to. I must have moved in my sleep." Eli sat up, running a hand through his hair. He looked tired, the dark stubble on his jaw thicker than the day before, the scar on his cheek standing out pale in the morning light. He swung his legs off the bunk, putting distance between them, giving her space to breathe. "You were cold," he said simply. "You were freezing to death, ma'am. There is no shame in surviving." He stood up and walked to the stove, his boots thudding softly on the dirt floor. He kept his back to her, and Lucy was grateful for the small mercy. She watched him crouch and stir the embers, feeding the last few scraps of wood into the firebox. He moved with a stiff grace, stretching his shoulders as if shaking off the cramp of holding still for so long. "I made you uncomfortable," she whispered. Eli paused, a piece of kindling in his hand. He looked over his shoulder. His dark eyes met hers, and for a second, she saw something raw there, not judgment, but a lingering echo of the night's closeness. "You did not," he said. He turned back to the stove. The fire caught, crackling softly. "We need to check that ankle," he said, changing the subject with a tone of finality. "And then we need to figure out how to get you out of here." Lucy shifted her leg, wincing. The boot felt like a vice around her swollen flesh. Eli returned to the bunk, dragging the three-legged table over to sit on. "May I?" he asked, gesturing to her foot. Lucy nodded, clutching the blanket tighter. Eli lifted her foot gently. He did not remove the boot. The swelling was likely too severe to get it back on if he did, but he probed the leather carefully, watching her face for reactions. It is not broken, he decided, but it is a bad sprain. You cannot walk on it, not for miles. Anyway, he looked toward the door, where the gray light was strengthening. The storm is gone, but it has left a mess. The trails will be mudslides. We have to go back, Lucy said, fear creeping into her voice. I cannot stay here. I have no food, no water. I know. Eli said, we cannot stay. We have no supplies, and this cold isn't going to let up. We have to head for town. Town. The word sat between them like a stone. Town meant safety from the elements, but it also meant Iron Creek. It meant Caleb Ward. It meant the eyes of the women who called her cursed and the men who called her loose. They will see us, Lucy murmured, staring at her hands, riding in together, after a night alone. Eli was silent for a moment. He knew the code of the West as well as anyone. A woman's reputation was as fragile as cheap glass. Being found in a lion shack with a strange man, miles from home, was enough to shatter whatever was left of it. Let them look, Eli said, his voice hardening. Better to be looked at than to be frozen stiff in a gully. I am not leaving you out here. He stood up and offered her his hand. Come on, let's get you on the horse. The world outside the shack was a study in devastation. The storm had scoured the hills clean. Scrub oak branches lay scattered like bones across the wet rocks. The ground was a slurry of mud and half-melted sleet that sucked at Eli's boots as he led the horses around. Lucy's mare was lame, favoring its left foreleg. It could walk, but it couldn't carry a rider. That meant they would have to ride double on Eli's big roan gelding. The process of mounting was undignified and painful. Eli had to lift Lucy, his hands firm on her waist, while she gritted her teeth against the throbbing in her ankle. He swung up behind her, settling into the saddle, his chest pressed against her back, his arms coming around her to hold the reins. It was the same position as the night before, but in the daylight, without the excuse of imminent death. It felt dangerously intimate. Lucy could feel the heat of him through her clothes. She could feel the steady beat of his heart against her shoulder blade. They set off at a slow walk, the roan picking its way carefully down the treacherous slope. The air was crisp and smelled of wet sage and ozone. For the first mile, they rode in silence. Lucy kept her head down, watching the horse's mane whip in the breeze. But as the miles dragged on, the silence became too heavy to bear. She felt a need to explain, to make him understand why she had been fleeing like a criminal in the night. It wasn't just the debt, she said suddenly, her voice thin in the vast open space. Eli didn't ask what she meant. He just shifted his grip on the reins. Listening. Caleb, Mr. Ward. He makes everyone think he is a savior. Lucy continued. When Thomas died, Caleb paid the funeral costs. He paid the grocer. He told everyone he was doing it out of respect for a good worker. But then he came to me privately. He showed me the ledger. He said a man of business must keep his accounts balanced. Eli's jaw tightened. He had known men like Ward, men who used money like a whip. He told me I could work it off, Lucy said, but the interest kept growing. No matter how many floors I scrubbed or how many meals I cooked, the number on the page got bigger, and then he started touching me. Just small things, a hand on my shoulder, a brush against my arm. But he did it like he owned the skin he was touching. She shuddered, and Eli felt the tremor run through her body. He told me the town sees me as damaged goods. She whispered, that no decent man would want a widow with a curse on her head. He said he was being generous by offering to take me in. He is a liar, Eli said. His voice was low, vibrating in his chest against her back. He is powerful, Lucy corrected. He owns the sheriff. He owns the bank. If I go back, if he sees me with you, let him see, Eli said. A man who preys on widows is no man at all. He is a coyote, and coyotes run when you stand your ground. Lucy wanted to believe him. She wanted to lean back into his strength and let him fight the world for her. But she knew Iron Creek. She knew how stories twisted and warped until the truth was buried under layers of spite. They are going to say I am a fallen woman, she said. tears pricking her eyes. Spending the night in the hills with a drifter. They will say I finally proved them right. Eli pulled on the reins, stopping the horse. The animal huffed, steam rising from its nostrils. Eli leaned forward, his mouth close to her ear. Listen to me. Lucy, you survived a storm that would have killed a lesser woman. You climbed out of a ravine with a twisted ankle. You are not fallen. You are standing, and anyone who says otherwise will have to answer to me. He clicked his tongue, and the horse moved forward again. Lucy swallowed the lump in her throat. She had spent 2 years feeling invisible, or worse, visible only as an object of pity or scorn. To have this man, this stranger with sadness in his eyes, defend her with such quiet conviction made her chest ache with a sudden, fierce gratitude. Iron Creek appeared on the horizon like a scar on the land. The buildings were sodden and dark. The streets churned into a quagmire of brown sludge. People were already out, sweeping water from boardwalks and clearing debris from the road. As they rode onto the main thoroughfare, the activity seemed to freeze. It started with a woman shaking a rug on a porch. She stopped, her mouth dropping open, eyes darting from Lucy's disheveled hair to Eli's arm wrapped around her waist. She elbowed the woman next to her, whispering behind a cupped hand. The whisper traveled faster than the wind. Heads turned. Men paused in their work, leaning on shovels, their gazes heavy and speculative. Lucy felt their eyes like physical touches. She kept her chin high, staring straight ahead, refusing to shrink, though every instinct screamed at her to hide. Well, look at that, she heard a man drawl from the sidewalk. The widow Hale found herself a warm blanket for the night. Reckon she did, another laughed. Didn't take her long to move on. Did it? Eli's arms tightened around her, not in a threat, but in a hold of support. He stared the men down as they passed, his dark eyes cold and unblinking. The laughter died away, replaced by uneasy shifting. They reached the boarding house. The white fence was broken in 2 places by fallen branches. As Eli reined the horse in, the front door flew open. Caleb Ward stepped out onto the porch. He was impeccably dressed, as always, though his boots were polished to a shine that mocked the muddy reality of the town. His face, usually a mask of calm control, contorted for a fraction of a second when he saw them, a flash of pure, unadulterated rage. But it vanished instantly, replaced by a performance of frantic concern. "Lucinda!" he cried, rushing down the steps, heedless of the mud splattering his trousers. "Thank God, we thought you were lost." He reached the horse before Eli could dismount. He grabbed Lucy's arm, his fingers digging into her flesh with possessive force. "You poor thing," he croaked, playing to the audience of townsfolk gathering nearby. "Out in that storm alone, I've been sick with worry." Lucy recoiled, flinching away from his touch. I am hurt. Caleb, let go." "Hurt?" Caleb's eyes widened theatrically. He looked up at Eli, his expression hardening into suspicion. "And who is this? Who has you on his horse?" Eli swung his leg over the saddle horn and dropped to the ground, landing with a heavy splash. He moved with a speed that belied his size, stepping between Caleb and the horse, forcing the rancher to release Lucy's arm. "Name is Eli Carter," he said, his voice flat, "and the lady is injured. She needs a doctor, not a man grabbing at her." Caleb straightened, bristling at the challenge. He looked Eli up and down, sneering at the worn duster and the mud-caked boots. "I can handle my fiancé's care. Mr. Carter, you have done enough, I am sure." "Fiancé?" Eli repeated, glancing up at Lucy. "I am not his fiancé," Lucy cried out, the denial sharp and desperate. Caleb's smile was thin and dangerous. "Now, Lucy, you are in shock. We can discuss the particulars later. Come down from there." He reached for her again. Eli stepped in, his shoulder blocking Caleb's path. It was a subtle move, but the threat was clear. "She said she is hurt," Eli said. "I will carry her." For a moment, the 2 men stood chest to chest in the muddy street. The tension crackled in the air, sharper than the lightning had been. The townspeople watched, breathless. Caleb Ward was the king of Iron Creek. Nobody defied him. Caleb's eyes flicked to the gun on Eli's hip, then back to his face. He saw something there, a lethal competence, that made him reconsider pushing the physical confrontation. He stepped back, smoothing his jacket. "Very well," he said icily. "The doctor is down the street. Bring her. But do not think this is over, Cowboy." Eli ignored him. He turned to the horse and reached up. "I have got you, Lucy," he said softly. He lifted her from the saddle, carrying her bridle style. Lucy wrapped her arm around his neck, burying her face in his coat to hide from the staring crowd. She felt safe in his arms, but she could feel the trap closing around them. Doctor. Abernathy's office smelled of rubbing alcohol and old paper. The doctor, a thin man with spectacles and a pinched nose, bound Lucy's ankle with efficient, unsympathetic hands. "You are lucky it is not broken. Mrs. Hale," he said, not looking at her, though I suppose luck is a relative term. He tied off the bandage with a sharp tug. "Spending the night in a line shack, well, people talk. A woman in your position should be more careful." "My position?" Lucy asked, her voice trembling. "I was thrown from a horse. I was dying. And yet, here you are," the doctor said, wiping his hands on a rag. "And there he is." He gestured with his chin toward the waiting room, where Eli stood by the window, watching the street. "Reputation is like a china cup, Mrs. Hale," the doctor sniffed. "Once it is cracked, it does not hold water." Lucy's face burned. She felt dirty, stained by his insinuation. She looked at Eli. He was standing rigid, his back to them. His jaw clenched so hard a muscle jumped in his cheek. He said nothing, likely knowing that any defense he mounted would only be twisted into further proof of their guilt. When they emerged from the office, Caleb was waiting. He had gathered a small audience, the mayor, the sheriff, and several prominent shopkeepers. "There she is," Caleb announced, his voice booming. He stepped forward, his face a mask of benevolent forgiveness. "Lucinda, my dear, I have spoken to the sheriff. We are willing to overlook the impropriety of this situation." "Impropriety?" Lucy stammered. "We understand you were frightened," Caleb said, his voice dripping with condescension. "And in your fear, you made a mistake. You compromised yourself. But I am a man of my word. I will not withdraw my proposal. In fact, for the sake of your honor, we should announce the engagement immediately." The men around him nodded approvingly. "Generous of you, Ward," the mayor muttered. "Most men wouldn't take her back after running off with a drifter. Protecting her honor." Someone else agreed. "That is the Christian thing to do." Lucy felt the ground sway beneath her good foot. It was a masterpiece of manipulation. Caleb had taken her escape, her desperate attempt to save her life, and turned it into a sin that only he could absolve. He was painting himself as the hero and her as the fallen woman he was graciously saving. If she refused him now, she wouldn't just be rejecting a suitor, she would be rejecting her own redemption. She would be confirming every nasty rumor. I cannot," she whispered. Caleb stepped closer, lowering his voice so only she and Eli could hear. "You have no money. Lucinda, you have no home. And now, thanks to your night in the hills, you have no reputation. Who else will have you? The cowboy? He is a drifter. He will be gone by sundown. And you will be alone in the mud." Lucy looked at Eli. He was watching Caleb with a look of pure, cold hatred. But he didn't speak. He couldn't. Anything he said would just make it look like they were lovers defending their sin. Caleb smiled, a triumphant curling of his lip. "I will give you until tomorrow to recover. My dear, then we will set the date." He tipped his hat to the crowd and walked away. The victor of a battle Lucy hadn't even realized she was fighting until it was lost. The boarding house was quiet that evening. Lucy sat on the edge of her narrow bed in the attic room. Her ankle was propped up on a pillow, but the pain in her leg was nothing compared to the hollow ache in her chest. She felt suffocated. Caleb's net was so tight she couldn't breathe. The town believed his story. They believed she was a loose woman who had been saved by a benevolent rancher. If she married him, she would be his prisoner. If she didn't, she would be a pariah, starved out of town. A knock came at the door. It was soft, hesitant. "Go away, Mrs. Gable," Lucy said, wiping her eyes. "It is not Mrs. Gable." Lucy froze. "Eli, come in," she whispered. The door opened. Eli had to duck his head to enter the low-ceilinged room. He had cleaned up. The mud was gone from his coat, and he had shaved, though the scar remained a stark white line. He held his hat in his hands, turning the brim in his fingers. He looked out of place in the tiny, feminine room, too large and too rugged for the delicate doilies and faded wallpaper. "I came to check on the ankle," he said awkwardly. "It hurts," Lucy said, "but I can walk." She gestured to the only chair. He sat down heavily. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The air was thick with the memory of the line shack, of the way they had held each other. "He has got you cornered," Eli said. He didn't phrase it as a question. "Yes," Lucy replied, looking at her hands. "He turned it all around. He made survival look like sin." "He is a smart man," Eli said, "and a cruel one. He says he is my only option," Lucy said, her voice breaking. "He says no one else would want me now. Because of us." Eli stopped turning his hat. He looked up, his gaze piercing. "Is that what you believe?" he asked. "I do not know what to believe. I only know that I am tired. Eli, I am so tired of fighting him." Eli stood up. He walked to the small window and looked out at the darkened street. He stood there for a long time, silent as a stone. When he turned back to her, his face was set, his expression grave. "There is another way," he said. "What way?" "He can only trap you because he claims he is protecting your honor," Eli said. "He is using the town's judgment against you, but what if the town didn't judge you? Or at least, what if they had no right to? I don't understand." Eli took a breath. He looked terrified, more scared than he had been in the storm. "Marry me," he said. The words hung in the air. Absurd and impossible. Lucy stared at him, her mouth parting. "What?" "Tell them you are engaged to me," Eli said, his words coming faster now. "Tell them we didn't just meet on the trail. Tell them I came here for you, that we have an understanding." "Eli, that is madness," Lucy said, her heart skipping a beat. "You are a stranger. They think you are a drifter, a killer. Let them think what they want about me," Eli said fiercely. "If you are promised to me, Caleb cannot claim he is saving you. He cannot claim you are loose if you are betrothed. A husband provides protection. Lucy, legal protection. He cannot force a married woman to pay her dead husband's debts in the same way." "But it would be a lie," Lucy whispered. "Is it?" Eli stepped closer. He dropped to one knee beside the bed, bringing his face level with hers. "It would be a shield," he said. "A way to buy time. We tell them we are engaged. I stay in town, I work, I stand between you and him. And when you are strong enough, when you have figured out a way to pay the debt or leave, we can dissolve it. Or," he trailed off. He didn't finish the sentence. "Or we make it real." Lucy looked into his eyes. She saw the same steadiness she had seen in the shack. She saw a man who had held her through the darkness and asked for nothing in return. "Why?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Why would you do this? You could ride away. You could leave this mess behind." Eli reached out and took her hand. His palm was rough, calloused, and warm. "Because I saw you in the storm," he said softly. "I saw you fighting to live. And I will be damned if I let a man like Caleb Ward snuff that light out." He squeezed her fingers. "And because, when you held on to me last night, Lucy, it was the first time in a long time I felt like I was worth something more than a gun." Lucy looked at their joined hands. She thought of Caleb's cold, manicured grip. Then she thought of Eli's arms, strong and safe. Marrying a stranger was ruinous. It was reckless. It was the sort of thing that happened in dime novels, not in real life. But the alternative was a slow death by suffocation. "I have nothing to give you," she whispered. "Just debts and a bad name." "You have yourself," Eli said. "That is enough." Lucy closed her eyes. She felt the edge of the precipice. She could step back into the cage, or she could jump into the unknown with this scarred cowboy. She opened her eyes. She squeezed his hand back. "Okay," she said. "Okay, we do it. We tell them." Eli let out a breath he seemed to have been holding since he walked in. He nodded, a slow, solemn movement. "We will do it tomorrow," he said. "In the light." He stood up, releasing her hand but letting his fingers linger for a second against hers. "Get some sleep, Lucy. You are going to need your strength." He walked to the door. "Eli," she called out. He turned, hand on the latch. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me yet," he replied, a grim smile touching his lips. "The hard part is just starting." The next morning, the sun finally broke through the clouds, bathing Iron Creek in a deceptive, golden light. The mud was still thick, sucking at boots and wagon wheels, but the air was clear. Lucy met Eli on the front porch of the boarding house. She wore her best dress, a simple gray cotton with a lace collar, and she had pinned her hair up neatly. She was pale, and she leaned heavily on a cane she had found in the hallway. But her head was high. Eli was waiting. He had brushed his hat and polished his boots as best he could. He looked dangerous and respectable all at once. "Ready?" he asked. "No," she admitted. "Good. That keeps you sharp." He offered her his arm. She took it. His forearm was hard as iron beneath his sleeve. They walked down the steps and onto the boardwalk. It was mid-morning, and the street was busy. As soon as they appeared, the silence spread like a ripple in a pond. Conversation stopped. Heads turned. They walked slowly, matched to Lucy's limping pace. They passed the mercantile. They passed the saloon. They passed the bank where Caleb Ward was undoubtedly watching from his office window. Lucy felt the stares pricking her skin. She heard the murmurs rising behind them like the buzzing of hornets. "Look at them, bold as brass. Is that the drifter? With the widow?" She felt a wave of dizziness. Her hand trembled on Eli's arm. "Steady," Eli murmured, covering her hand with his own. "Just keep walking. Don't look down." He led her right down the center of the town, not skulking in the shadows, but parading in the light. He was claiming her. He was telling the world that she was not discarded, not broken, and not alone. They reached the end of the boardwalk and turned to cross the street toward the church. The mud was deep here. Eli didn't hesitate. He tightened his grip on her hand, lacing his fingers through hers. A shocking, intimate gesture in the Victorian West. Lucy looked up at him. He was looking straight ahead, his jaw set, his eyes fierce. He squeezed her hand, a silent promise. "I have got you." And for the first time in 2 years, walking through the mud with a man she barely knew, Lucinda Hale didn't feel cursed. She felt dangerous. She squeezed his hand back, and they walked on together, refusing to let go. The mud on the main street of Iron Creek was ankle-deep, a thick, sucking slurry that threatened to pull boots right off feet. Eli Carter did not seem to notice it. He stood on the steps of the dry goods store, a vantage point that gave him a clear view of the bustling street and the saloon opposite. Lucy stood beside him, her hand trembling slightly in the crook of his arm, though her chin was held high. A crowd had gathered, drawn by the spectacle of the widow and the drifter parading through town. It was a motley collection of miners, shopkeepers, and ranch hands, their faces a mixture of curiosity and judgment. Eli raised his voice. It was not a shout, but a projection that carried over the murmur of the crowd and the wind rattling the storefront signs. "There has been talk," he began, his tone flat and hard as granite. "Talk about this lady. Talk about where she was during the storm." He scanned the faces in the crowd, meeting eyes until men looked away. Mrs. Hale was thrown from her horse. She was injured. I found her on the trail and brought her to shelter. We spent the night in a line shack because the weather gave us no choice. A few men snickered near the back. Eli's gaze snapped to them instantly, silencing the sound. I slept on the floor. He lied smoothly, though the truth of their closeness was written in the heat rising on Lucy's cheeks. I protected her life and her honor, and now I intend to protect her future. He paused, letting the words sink in. He took Lucy's hand, lifting it so everyone could see their joined fingers. "Mrs. Hale has agreed to become my wife. We are engaged." A collective gasp went through the crowd. This was not the penitent widow begging for forgiveness. This was a woman making a choice. "If any man here has a question about my intentions, or about the lady's virtue," Eli continued, his hand dropping to rest casually near the Colt revolver on his hip, "he can ask me, directly. I will be right here." Silence stretched for a long, tense moment. Then, from the doorway of the saloon, a voice rang out. "Well, I say good for them." It was Mary, a washerwoman with red, raw hands and a reputation for speaking her mind. She stepped onto the boardwalk, glaring at the men around her. She nearly died in that storm. If this man saved her, he is a better Christian than the lot of you who just sat inside and gossiped. A few heads nodded. The miners, men who knew the terrors of the earth and sky, murmured their agreement. They respected survival, but others were not so easily swayed. Mrs. Gable, watching from the boarding house porch, pursed her lips until they were a thin white line. Moving from one bed to another, she whispered to her neighbor, "And with a drifter, it is indecent." Just then, the door to the bank opened. Caleb Ward stepped out. He was smiling, but his eyes were like chips of flint. He walked through the mud, the crowd parting for him like the Red Sea. He stopped at the bottom of the steps, looking up at Eli and Lucy. "Mr. Carter," he said, his voice smooth as oil, "you certainly know how to make an entrance." Eli looked down at him. "Mr. Ward." "And Lucinda?" Caleb said, turning his gaze on her. It felt like a physical weight. "I must say, I am surprised. I thought we had an understanding." Lucy squeezed Eli's arm, her knuckles white. "We did not, Caleb. You had an expectation. I had a debt." Caleb's smile didn't waver, but a muscle jumped in his jaw. "Well, a debt is a debt, regardless of who warms your bed. I trust your fiancé is prepared to take on your obligations?" Eli stepped forward, shielding Lucy. "We will settle what is owed. In due time." Caleb chuckled. A dry, humorless sound. "I'm sure you will, though a cowboy's wages don't stretch very far in this territory. But I wish you both the best. Truly, it is a rare thing to see such rapid affection." He tipped his hat, the gesture mocking. "Congratulations." He turned and walked away, his back stiff. As he passed the sheriff, he leaned in and murmured something. The sheriff glanced at Eli, his expression darkening, before nodding slowly. Lucy let out a breath she felt she had been holding for an hour. "He is not going to let this go," she whispered. "No," Eli said, watching Caleb's retreating back. "He is not, but neither are we." They did not wait for papers or a ceremony to start their life. To wait was to give the town time to tear them apart. They needed a fortress, however small. Eli had a small stash of gold coins, savings from 5 years of driving cattle and eating dust. It wasn't a fortune, but it was enough to rent a derelict cabin on the southern edge of town, a place that had been empty since a prospector died there the previous winter. It was a rough structure, the logs gray and weathered, the roof patched with sod and rusted tin. The land around it was rocky, overgrown with sagebrush and thistle, but there was a creek nearby, and the soil beneath the rocks was dark and rich. For the next 2 weeks, their life became a brutal, rhythmic cycle of labor. They woke before dawn. The cabin was always freezing, the wind whistling through the chinking in the logs. Eli would rise first, stoking the stove with wood he had chopped the night before. Lucy would wake to the sound of the axe ringing in the yard and the smell of coffee boiling. They worked side by side. There was no division of labor based on what was proper. There was only what needed to be done to survive. They spent 3 days mending the fence that marked their small plot. Eli dug the post holes, the ground fighting him with every strike of the spade. Lucy hauled stones to brace the posts, her hands wrapped in rags to protect her healing blisters. One afternoon, a cold rain began to fall. The roof, which they had thought was sound, began to leak in 3 places. "Get the bucket!" Eli shouted over the drumming of the rain on the tin. Lucy scrambled to place their single bucket under a steady stream of water near the bunk. Then another leak sprang over the stove. She grabbed a skillet, "We need more tar," she yelled. "I am going up." Eli grabbed a sheet of scrap tin they had scavenged from the dump behind the mine. "You cannot go up there in this. It is slick as ice. I have to, or we will be sleeping in a puddle." He climbed the rough ladder, slipping and cursing. Lucy stood below, holding the ladder steady in the mud, her heart in her throat as she watched him wrestle the metal sheet against the wind. When he came down, soaked and shivering, his knuckles skinned and bleeding, she was waiting with a hot towel. She wiped the rain from his face, her touch gentle. "You are a fool." "Eli Carter, maybe?" He grinned, his teeth chattering. "But we are dry." They ate their meals at a table Eli had built from packing crates. It was simple fare: beans, cornbread. Sometimes a rabbit Eli had snared, but they ate together, the silence between them no longer heavy with awkwardness, but filled with the comfortable exhaustion of shared purpose. At night, the cabin shrank. The darkness outside pressed against the windows, making the circle of lamplight feel like the only safe place in the world. They had one bunk. It was narrow. In the first few nights, Eli had slept on a pallet on the floor, giving Lucy the bed, but the floor was freezing, drafts sweeping across the planks like icy fingers. Lucy would hear him shivering in his sleep. On the fourth night, she had spoken up. "This is ridiculous," she said into the dark. "You are freezing, and I have half a blanket I do not need." Eli didn't answer for a long time. "Lucy, get in the bunk. Eli, we are fully clothed. We are exhausted, and we are supposed to be engaged. It is a waste of heat." He had hesitated, his honor warring with the cold, but practicality won. He climbed into the bunk, lying stiffly on the very edge, his back to her. "Good night, Eli," she had whispered. "Good night, Lucy." But as the nights went on, the stiffness faded. They gravitated toward each other in sleep, seeking warmth. They woke up with legs tangled, arms draped over waists. Each morning brought a flustered pulling away, a muttered apology, but the boundaries were eroding, worn down by the wind and the proximity. It was a Tuesday evening when the tension finally snapped. They had spent the day hauling water from the creek. The buckets were heavy, the bank steep and slick with mud. Lucy's arms ached with a deep, throbbing burn. The wind had been relentless, whipping her hair into her face and stinging her eyes. They were inside now. The fire was roaring, the cabin warm and smelling of pine resin. Lucy was washing dishes in a basin, her back to the room. Eli was sitting at the table, oiling his boots. She turned to dry a plate and caught him watching her. His gaze was dark, intense, focused on the curve of her neck where a stray lock of hair had fallen. He didn't look away when she caught him. Lucy set the plate down. Her hands were trembling. "Thank you," she said softly. Eli blinked, breaking the spell. "For what? For this?" She gestured around the rough room. "For the roof, for the water, for giving me a choice when nobody else would." Eli stood up. He walked over to her. He loomed large in the small space, smelling of leather and work. "You did the work too. Lucy, you hauled half that water. It is not just the work," she said, looking up at him. "It is. I was drowning. Eli, and you pulled me out." She saw his eyes soften, the hard lines of his face relaxing. "I didn't do anything a decent man wouldn't do. You did more," she whispered. The air between them seemed to vibrate. The heat from the stove was suddenly stifling. Lucy looked at his mouth. She remembered the feeling of his chest against her back on the horse, the strength of his arms in the line shack. Overwhelmed by a sudden surge of gratitude and a longing she could no longer name as anything but desire, she took a step forward. She placed a hand on his chest, right over his heart. It was beating fast. She stood on her tiptoes and pressed her lips to his. It was a hesitant kiss, a question. "Is this okay?" Eli went still for a heartbeat. Then he made a low sound in his throat, something between a groan and a sigh. His arms came around her, pulling her flush against him. One hand tangled in her hair, tilting her head back. He kissed her back. It wasn't gentle. It was desperate. It was the taste of months of loneliness, of fear and adrenaline, and the raw need for connection. His mouth moved over hers with a hunger that stole her breath. Lucy gasped. Opening to him, she wrapped her arms around his neck, pulling him closer, wanting to merge with him, to erase the space where the cold could get in. They stumbled backward. Eli's hip bumped the table, knocking the oil tin over, but neither noticed. He backed her toward the bunk, his kisses trailing down her jaw to the sensitive skin of her throat. "Lucy," he murmured against her skin. "Lucy." She felt his hands on her waist, sliding up her ribs, his thumbs grazing the swell of her breast through the cotton of her dress. Her body arched into him, electric shocks running through her veins. They reached the bunk and collapsed onto it, a tangle of limbs and heavy breathing. Eli hovered over her, his weight pressing her into the mattress. He stared down at her, his eyes dilated, his chest heaving. He looked wild. He looked like the storm. Lucy reached up, tracing the scar on his jaw. "Kiss me again," she whispered. He lowered his head, capturing her lips. His hand moved to the buttons of her bodice. He undid the top one, then the second. His fingers brushed the skin of her collarbone, hot and rough. Lucy's breath hitched. Fear flickered in the back of her mind. Fear of judgment. Fear of losing the fragile respectability she was trying to rebuild. "If we do this," but then she felt his heart pounding against hers, and the fear was swallowed by a terrifying, beautiful realization. "I want to be alive. I want to be his." She arched up to meet him. Eli froze. His hand stilled on the third button. He pulled back, his breathing ragged. He looked into her eyes, searching deep. "Lucy," he rasped. "Are you sure?" Lucy stared up at him. Her lips were swollen, her hair wild around her face. Tears welled in her eyes, blurring his face. "I am scared," she admitted, her voice shaking. "I am scared of what people will say. I am scared that I am broken." Eli started to pull away, respect warring with desire. "No," she said, grabbing his shirt. "Don't go. I am scared. But I am more scared of never feeling this, of never feeling you." Eli rested his forehead against hers. He closed his eyes, fighting for control. "We have to be sure. If we cross this line, there is no going back. You understand that?" "I know. We are not married yet." "Lucy, if I take you now, and something happens—" "Nothing will happen," she said fiercely. He pulled back, propping himself up on his elbows. He looked at her with a tenderness that broke her heart. "We wait," he said softly. "Not because I don't want you. God, Lucy, I want you so much it hurts, but because I want to do this right. I want to give you the courtship you never had. I want you to come to me without fear." Lucy let out a sob, half laugh, half cry. She reached up and pulled him down, burying her face in his neck. "Okay," she whispered. "We wait, but don't let go. I won't." They didn't move from the bunk. They lay there as the fire died down, fully clothed, limbs entwined. Eli stroked her hair, his touch soothing now, not demanding. They talked in whispers. Eli told her about his childhood in Kentucky, about the green hills and the horses. Lucy told him about her father, a stern man who never laughed, and how Thomas had been her escape that turned into a tragedy. They mapped the scars on each other's souls, building a bridge of words over the chasm of their pasts. It was intimate in a way that flesh against flesh could never be. It was the intimacy of being known. While Lucy and Eli built their sanctuary, Caleb Ward was busy tearing down the world outside it. He didn't attack them directly. That would be crude. Instead, he pulled the invisible strings he had tied around the town. It started with the Millers. They were a poor family who lived in a shack on the edge of Ward's grazing land. Mrs. Miller had been kind to Lucy, slipping her extra eggs when times were hard. 3 days after the announcement in town, Eli came back from the general store empty-handed. His face was grim. "What happened?" Lucy asked. "Storekeeper says my credit is no good," Eli said, tossing his hat on the table. "Says he needs cash up front. For flour. But we have always paid on time." "Ward." Eli spat. He got to him. Later that afternoon, they saw a wagon trundling down the road. It was piled high with meager possessions. A rocking chair, a crate of chickens, a crying baby wrapped in a shawl. Lucy ran out to the fence. It was the Millers. Mrs. Miller, Lucy called. Where are you going? The woman looked down from the wagon seat. Her eyes were red-rimmed. Evicted. Lucy, Mr. Ward's men came this morning, said the land is needed for grazing. We have to be off by sundown. But where will you go? Mrs. Miller shook her head. Don't know. South, maybe. She looked at Lucy, and then at Eli, who had come up behind her. He is a hard man. Lucy, be careful. He destroys what he cannot keep. The wagon rattled away, leaving Lucy standing in the dust, her heart cold. Caleb wasn't just hurting them. He was hurting anyone who had ever shown her kindness. He was isolating her, cutting off her support system root by branch. That night, the nightmares came back. Lucy was back in the mine. The darkness was absolute. She could smell the wet earth, taste the copper tang of blood. She heard the rumble, low at first, then building to a deafening roar. Run, she screamed, but her feet were stuck in the mud. She looked up. The ceiling of the tunnel was cracking, but it wasn't rocks falling. It was coins, gold coins, raining down like hail, crushing everything beneath them. And then she saw him. Not Thomas, Eli. He was standing under a support beam, holding it up with his bare shoulders. His face was contorted with effort. Eli, move! I cannot let go, he shouted. I have to hold it. The beam snapped. The earth rushed down. Eli vanished under the rubble. Lucy woke up screaming. No, Eli, no! She was thrashing, tangling in the blankets. Strong arms grabbed her. Lucy, wake up! It is a dream! She gasped, her eyes flying open. The cabin was dark. Eli was holding her, his face pale in the moonlight filtering through the window. She clutched his shirt, pulling him down to her. You were dead. He buried you. The mine, it fell on you. Shh, Eli soothed, rocking her. I am here. I am right here. He held her until her heart slowed, stroking her back, but his own heart was racing. Lucy, he said quietly, when she had calmed down, tell me about the mine. The real mine. I told you, she whispered. It collapsed. The storm. No, Eli said. Tell me the details. You said in your sleep. Something about water. And coins. Lucy closed her eyes. The dream was fading, but the memories it had dredged up were sharp. Thomas, he came home angry the week before he died. He said the new foreman, a man named Mr. Blackwood, was arguing with Caleb. Arguing about what? Digging deeper. Thomas said they had hit a wet patch. Water was seeping through the rock. The miners said the supports were soft. They wanted to stop, to shore it up. And Caleb said no. He said the vein was just a few feet further. He said time is money, and fear is expensive. Eli went still. Negligence. And there was something else. Lucy said, sitting up. Her eyes widened in the dark. The foreman, Mr. Blackwood. He vanished. After the collapse. He was supposed to testify at the inquest, but he never showed up. People said he ran off. Ashamed. But Thomas liked him. He said Blackwood was an honest man. He wouldn't have run. Eli got out of bed. He paced the small room, the floorboards creaking. If Caleb ignored warnings about the water, that is manslaughter, Eli said. If he silenced the foreman, that is murder. He stopped at the window, looking out toward the dark silhouette of the hills where the mine entrance lay sealed. It wasn't an accident. Lucy shivered. The realization settled over her like a cold shroud. Thomas hadn't just died. He had been sacrificed. Caleb killed him. She whispered. For money. And now he is trying to destroy us to keep it quiet, Eli said. He is not just jealous. Lucy, he is afraid. He knows that if you start asking questions, if you have a man beside you who isn't afraid of him, the truth might come out. He turned back to her. His face was hard. The soldier back in command. We have to find out what happened. How? The mine is sealed. The witnesses are gone. Not all of them, Eli said. There are men in this town who know. Men who drink too much to forget. Men who were paid to look the other way. We will find them, Lucy said, a new strength rising in her voice. We will find them, and we will make them speak. The sun was setting the next day as they rode out to the old mine site. They left the horses at the bottom of the hill and walked up the overgrown path. The entrance was a scar in the hillside, boarded up with heavy timbers and marked with a weathered sign, "Danger, keep out." The wind whistled through the tall, dry grass, a mournful, hollow sound. The sky to the west was a bruised crimson, bleeding into the coming night. Lucy hugged her shawl tighter around herself. She stood before the boarded entrance. This was where Thomas lay, somewhere deep under that rock. "I am sorry." "Tom," she whispered, "I am so sorry I didn't fight for you." Eli stood beside her, his hat in his hand. He placed a hand on her shoulder. "You are fighting now," he said. He walked up to the boards. He ran his hand over the wood. It was new, newer than it should be for a mine closed 2 years ago. "Someone has been here," he muttered, keeping it sealed. He turned to look at the town below, twinkling in the twilight. It looked peaceful from up here, but it was built on bones. "We are going to open this wound, Lucy," Eli said quietly. "And it is going to bleed. Caleb will come for us with everything he has." "I don't care," Lucy said. She looked at the mine, then at Eli. Her eyes were dry and fierce. "He took my husband. He took my reputation. He tried to take my life. I am done running." She reached out and took Eli's hand. "Find out the truth, Eli, for Thomas, for the Millers, for us." Eli squeezed her hand. "I swear it, Lucy. I will turn over every rock in this territory until I find the rot underneath." He looked back at the darkening horizon. "Let the storm come," he said. "We are ready." The investigation began not with a shout, but with a quiet, persistent scratching at the surface of the town's silence. Eli Carter moved through Iron Creek like a shadow, his presence a constant, low-level irritant to the men who preferred things to remain buried. He did not ask questions in the open, where Caleb Ward's eyes and ears were everywhere. Instead, he lingered near the livery stable, the back alleys behind the general store, and the loading docks where the freight wagons came in. He learned quickly that the men who had worked the deep shift on the day of the collapse were mostly gone. Some had moved on to the silver mines in Nevada. Others had simply vanished, drifting like tumbleweeds. But there was one name that kept surfacing in the hushed, reluctant murmurs of the stable hands. Hank. Hank was an old Cornish miner, a man whose lungs were half filled with coal dust and whose spirit had been broken long before the mine fell. He lived in a tar paper shack on the very edge of town, where the prairie scrub met the accumulated refuse of civilization. Eli found him there late one afternoon, sitting on an overturned crate, staring at the gray horizon. He was shivering. Though the air was not particularly cold, a bottle of cheap whiskey sat near his boot, but Eli noted that the man's hands shook too badly to hold it steady. Eli did not approach him with aggression. He walked up slowly, his boots crunching softly on the gravel. He held 2 tin cups and a pot of fresh, hot coffee he had brewed over a small fire nearby. "Afternoon," Eli said, offering a cup. Hank looked up. His eyes were watery and rimmed with red, set deep in a face that looked like crumpled parchment. He eyed the coffee suspiciously, then the scar on Eli's face. "I have no money for handouts." "Cowboy," Hank rasped. His voice sounded like rocks grinding together. "I am not asking for money," Eli said, pouring the dark liquid. "Just thought you might want something to warm your chest. Whiskey only numbs the cold. It does not chase it away." Hank hesitated, then reached out with a trembling hand. He took the cup, wrapping both palms around it. He took a sip and sighed. A long, rattling exhalation. "You are the one, aren't you?" Hank asked, looking into the steam. "The one with the widow Hale?" "I am. You are stirring up mud." "Son, mud is best left settled." Eli sat down on a nearby stump, nursing his own coffee. "Mud hides things. Hank, sometimes it hides things that need to see the light." Hank gave a bitter, wheezing chuckle. "Or it hides things that will kill you if you dig them up." Eli let the silence stretch. He knew men like Hank, They carried secrets like heavy stones, and sooner or later, they got tired of the weight. Lucy Hale is a good woman, Eli said softly. She blames herself for her husband's death. She thinks she sent him to his grave by asking for money. She carries that guilt every day. Hank's hands tightened on the cup. He wasn't a bad sort. Thomas, young, strong back, loved that girl. Used to talk about her in the tunnels during lunch. He didn't have to die, did he, Hank? The old man flinched. It was an act of God. That is what the paper said. The storm. Eli leaned forward, his voice dropping to a low, intense rumble. I know about the storm, but I also know about rock. And I know that deep shafts don't just collapse because it is raining outside, unless the water has somewhere to go. Unless the supports are weak. Hank closed his eyes. He took a long swallow of coffee. Bring her, he whispered. What? Bring the girl? I will not talk to a stranger. If I'm going to hang myself, I want to look her in the eye when I do it. The next day, Eli brought Lucy to the shack. She wore her darkest shawl, her face pale but composed. The sight of the old miner, wrecked and discarded by the industry that had killed her husband, seemed to steel her resolve. Hank refused to look at her at first. He stared at his boots. His breathing labored. Tell her. Hank, Eli said gently. It was the vein. Hank muttered. He looked up, his eyes filled with a terrified shame. The crimson vein, that is what the foreman called it. We had traces of it 2 weeks before the storm. High-grade copper, maybe silver mixed in. It was rich, but it was deep, Lucy said, her voice trembling. It was deep. Hank agreed, and it was unstable. We were close to the water table. The rock was soft, weeping water even on dry days. We told the foreman. We told Mr. Ward. We said we needed to shore up the main drift before we went any further. We needed heavy timber, seasoned oak, and, Eli asked. Hank spat on the ground. Ward said no. He said there was a rival claim being filed on the adjacent parcel. He said if we didn't tap that vein and register it within the month, he would lose the rights. He told us to skip every third support beam. Said it would save 2 days of labor. Lucy made a small, choked sound, covering her mouth with her hand. Skip the supports, she whispered. Hank nodded miserably. We argued. Thomas argued. He said it was a death trap, but Ward threatened to fire the lot of us. Said he would bring in Chinamen from the railroad who wouldn't complain. We had families. Mrs. Hale. We needed the wage. So you dug, Eli said, his voice hard as flint. We dug. Then the storm hit. The ground was already saturated. When the water started coming down the shaft, there was nothing to hold the weight. The timbers, they just snapped. Like matchsticks. I was near the lift. I got out. Thomas, he was right at the face. He never had a chance. Lucy was crying silently, tears tracking through the dust on her cheeks. It wasn't an accident, she said. It was greed. It was murder, Eli corrected. There is more, Hank said, his voice dropping to a whisper. Afterward, the sheriff came around, and Ward. They gave the survivors $50 each. A lot of money. They brought a paper. It said the collapse was unforeseeable. An act of nature. They said if we signed it, we got the money. If we didn't, well, accidents happen to men who talk. And you signed it? Lucy asked. Hank looked at her, his expression broken. I signed it. I took the blood money and I drank it away. And now I am dying of dust lung. And I reckon I deserve it. Lucy stared at him. She should have hated him. He had sold the truth of her husband's death for $50. But looking at this wreck of a man, she felt only a scorching, purifying fury directed at the puppet master. Thank you, Hank, she said, her voice surprisingly steady. Hank looked shocked. You thank me for the truth, she said. It is the only thing I have left. They walked back toward their cabin in silence, the weight of the revelation settling between them. The wind whipped at their clothes, but Lucy didn't feel the cold. She felt a fire burning in her chest, hotter than any stove. He killed him, she said, staring straight ahead. He killed Thomas to beat a claim filing. And then he tried to buy me to cover his guilt. He is a monster, Eli said. We have to go to the sheriff. Lucy said, Eli shook his head. You heard Hank? The sheriff was the one who brought the papers. He is on Ward's payroll. If we go to him, the only thing that will happen is Hank will end up dead and we will end up in a cell. Then what do? We cannot let him get away with this. We go over his head. Eli said, this is a territory, not a kingdom. There are federal judges, there are marshals, and there are newspapers in Helena and Denver that love a story about corruption. We write to them. We write everything. We name names. We detail the bribe. We send it out on the next stagecoach, but we give it directly to the driver, not the postmaster here. It was a dangerous plan. It was a declaration of war. For 3 nights, they sat at the small table in the cabin, working by the light of a tallow candle, Lucy wrote, her penmanship neat and flowing, pouring the facts onto the page. Eli paced, dictating the technical details of the mine, the things Hank had explained about the supports and the water table. They drafted 2 letters, one to the United States Territorial Judge in Virginia City, one to the editor of the Rocky Mountain Gazette. They sealed them with wax. This changes everything, Eli said, his hand resting on the envelopes. Once these are gone, there is no turning back. Lucy placed her hand over his. I am done turning back. Caleb Ward was not a man who missed much. He had eyes in the saloon, in the stable, and on the street. He knew Eli had been speaking to the old miners. He knew they had visited Hank. The confrontation happened 2 days later, on the boardwalk outside the dry goods store. Lucy was carrying a basket of eggs she had traded for, walking alone while Eli was at the blacksmith's getting a tool repaired. Mrs. Hale. The voice stopped her cold. She turned to find Caleb standing there, leaning against a support post. He looked relaxed, casual, but his eyes were reptilian. Mr. Ward, she said, clutching the basket. I hear you and your fiancé have been making friends with the riffraff. Caleb said. Old Hank. Sad case, that one. Mind is gone. Drank away his senses years ago. He seemed lucid enough to me, Lucy said, meeting his gaze. Caleb pushed off the post and took a step closer. He lowered his voice, the veneer of politeness slipping. You are listening to ghost stories, Lucinda, and you are repeating them. That is a dangerous habit. Iron Creek is a peaceful town. We do not like people who poison the water. I am not poisoning anything, she said. I am just looking for the source of the rot. Caleb's face hardened. He looked down the street toward the blacksmith shop, where the ring of a hammer could be heard. Accidents happen. Lucinda, he said softly. Mines collapse. Horses stumble. Guns go off when people are cleaning them. It would be a tragedy if your new protector met with misfortune. Just when you found him. Lucy's breath hitched. It was a naked threat. If you touch him, she began. Caleb smiled, a cold, empty expression. Go home, widow. Be grateful for the roof you have, while you still have it. He tipped his hat and walked away. Lucy stood trembling on the boardwalk, the basket shaking in her hands. That night, the wind howled down from the north, carrying the scent of snow. Eli and Lucy went to bed early, exhausted from the tension that hung over them like a shroud. They had sent the letters that morning, entrusting them to a stage driver Eli knew from the war. The die was cast. They slept in the narrow bunk, spooned together for warmth. Eli's arm was draped over her waist, his breathing slow and deep. Lucy drifted in a restless doze, her dreams filled with dark tunnels and falling rocks. She woke to the sound of coughing. At first, she thought it was part of the dream. Then she realized her eyes were stinging. The air was thick and gray. Eli, she gasped, sitting up. Eli woke instantly, his soldier's instincts kicking in. Smoke! He rolled out of the bunk, landing in a crouch. The cabin was filled with a choking, acrid haze. An orange glow flickered beneath the door and through the cracks in the window shutters. Get up! Eli roared. He grabbed Lucy, pulling her from the bed. She stumbled, her nightgown catching on the rough blanket. The heat was already rising, a physical wall pressing against them. Eli grabbed his trousers, hopping on one leg to pull them on, then grabbed his gun belt. He didn't bother with a shirt. He threw a blanket around Lucy's shoulders. "The door!" he yelled. He kicked the door. It didn't budge. It had been barred from the outside. "We are trapped!" Lucy screamed, panic seizing her throat. Eli didn't waste time trying again. He spun toward the window. The small pane of glass was already cracking from the heat. He used the butt of his revolver to smash the rest of the glass and the wooden shutter beyond. Fresh air rushed in, feeding the fire. The flames roared, leaping up the walls. The dry timber of the cabin, seasoned by years of sun and wind, was burning like kindling. "Out!" Eli shouted. He lifted Lucy, shoving her through the small window frame. She tumbled out onto the cold, wet ground, scraping her arms. "Eli!" she screamed, scrambling up. He came diving out after her, landing heavily in the mud just as the roof beam inside groaned and collapsed with a shower of sparks. They scrambled backward, coughing and gasping, their lungs burning. They stopped 10 yards away, huddled together in the dirt, watching their home die. The fire was a living thing, a ravenous beast of orange and red against the black sky. It consumed the roof, the walls, the furniture they had built, the food they had stored. "My tin!" Lucy cried out, starting to move forward. "The locket! The Bible!" Eli grabbed her, holding her back. "It is gone! Lucy, it is gone!" She collapsed against him, sobbing. Everything. Her last connection to her mother, her husband's Bible, the money Eli had saved. It was all turning to ash before their eyes. They watched until the cabin was nothing but a glowing skeleton of charcoal. The heat seared their faces, but their backs were freezing in the night wind. They were alive, but they were destitute. Morning brought a bleak, gray light that revealed the extent of the ruin. A pile of black ash and twisted metal was all that remained of their sanctuary. A small crowd gathered on the road. Some people looked horrified, their hands covering their mouths. Others looked away, unwilling to meet Eli's gaze. "Mrs." Gable stood with the baker's wife. "Reckon they upset the wrong people," the baker's wife whispered, loud enough to be heard. "That is what comes of pride. Defiance brings fire," another man muttered. Lucy sat on a rock, wrapped in the soot-stained blanket, her feet bare and muddy. She felt naked, exposed. The town wasn't mourning with them. They were judging them. They saw this not as a crime, but as a correction, a restoring of the natural order where Caleb Ward was king and dissenters were crushed. "Is it worth it?" she whispered, her voice cracking. Eli was standing over the ruins, poking through the ash with a stick. He found the twisted remains of the iron bed frame. He looked up at her, his face streaked with soot, his eyes wild. "What did you say?" "Is it worth it?" Lucy repeated, looking at him. "We have lost everything. Eli, the locket. It was all I had of my mother. The money. That was your freedom." Eli threw the stick down. He walked over to her, his movements jerky with rage. "This wasn't an accident." "Lucy, I know," she cried. "I know it wasn't, but look at us. We are dirt poor, we are homeless, and we are lucky to be alive. Maybe we should have just left. Maybe we should just go." Eli went still. He looked at the smoking ruin, then toward the town where Caleb Ward sat in his warm house. "No," he said. His voice was terrifyingly calm. He walked over to where his saddle lay near the fence. He had managed to drag the tack out of the shed before the sparks caught it, but the shed itself was gone. He pulled his rifle from the scabbard. He checked the load in his revolver. "Eli, what are you doing?" Lucy stood up, the blanket slipping from her shoulders. "I am going to finish this," he said. "You are going to kill him. He tried to burn us alive. Lucy, if I hadn't woken up." "You are going to walk into town and shoot him? Then what? The sheriff hangs you, and Caleb dies a martyr. The poor rancher murdered by the violent drifter." Eli strapped the gun belt on. His hands were shaking, not from fear, but from the adrenaline of a soldier who has been attacked. "I don't care," he snarled. "I am done writing letters. I am done being patient. He wants a war. I will give him a war." He turned to walk toward the road. Lucy lunged at him. She grabbed his arm, digging her fingers into his bicep. "Stop!" she screamed. Eli tried to shake her off, but she held on with desperate strength. "Look at me, Eli, look at me." He stopped, turning his furious gaze on her. "If you kill him, "He wins," she said, tears streaming down her soot-stained face. "He wins because he turned you into exactly what he said you were. A killer. A brute." "I am a killer," Eli shouted, his voice breaking. "That is what I know. That is how I protect you. I failed. Lucy, I couldn't keep a roof over your head. You saved my life," she yelled back. "You carried me out of the fire. That is who you are." She reached up, cupping his face, her thumbs wiping away the soot. "You are not a weapon, Eli. You are the man who held me in the storm. You are the man who built a home with his bare hands. If you throw that away for blood, then he takes you from me too, and I cannot bear that. Please, do not make me lose another husband to this town." Eli stared at her. The word husband hung in the air. His chest heaved. Slowly, the red haze of rage began to recede, replaced by a crushing, exhausting grief. He let the rifle drop to his side, his shoulders slumped. "I don't know what to do," he whispered. "I don't know how to fight a man who owns the law." "We wait," Lucy said, pulling him into a hug. "We wait for the judge. We survive. We do not let him break us." They had nowhere to go but back to the lion's den. They walked into town, soot-stained and ragged. They went to the boarding house. Mrs. Gable met them at the door. She looked at their ruined clothes, at Lucy's bare feet. For a moment, she looked like she would turn them away, but then she looked at Lucy's face, the sheer exhaustion and determination etched there. "I have the spare room, Mrs." Gable said stiffly. "It is small, and I expect payment when you can find work." "Thank you," Lucy said quietly. The room was barely a closet, tucked under the eaves. It had a single narrow bed and a washstand. It was cold, but it wasn't burning. That night, they sat on the edge of the bed. They had washed the soot from their faces, but the smell of smoke lingered in their hair. Eli sat with his head in his hands. He was trembling. "I thought I was back there," he said, his voice muffled. "Where?" "Shiloh. The wilderness." He looked up, his eyes haunted. "We burned things, farms, houses. We were ordered to deny the enemy shelter. I watched families run out of burning houses just like we did. I told myself it was war. I told myself it was necessary." He looked at his hands, turning them over. "I thought I had left it behind, but when I woke up in the smoke, I felt like I deserved it, like it was judgment coming for me." Lucy moved closer. She wrapped her arms around him, pulling his head down to her shoulder. "It was not judgment," she whispered fiercely. "It was a crime committed by a wicked man. You are not that soldier anymore. Eli, I wanted to kill him. Lucy, I wanted to feel him die. That scares me. It scares me that the violence is still so close to the surface." "It is there because you love me," she said. "It is there because you are protecting us." "But you chose not to. You chose me over the anger. That is what matters." She kissed his temple, then his cheek, then his lips. It was a slow, deliberate kiss. It wasn't about passion, it was about affirmation. It was a way of saying, "I am here. We are real." Eli let out a shuddering breath and wrapped his arms around her. He held her as if she were the only solid thing in a dissolving world. "I love you," he whispered. It was the first time he had said it. "I love you," she answered. They lay back on the bed, the springs creaking. They were exhausted, battered, and penniless. But as they held each other in the dark, listening to the wind rattle the window pane, the bond between them hardened into something unbreakable. It was a love forged in ice and tempered in fire. They chose each other fully, knowing that the morning might bring ruin, but refusing to face it alone. 5 days later, the stagecoach from Virginia City rattled into town. It was coated in dust, the horses lathered. It stopped in front of the hotel. The driver tossed down the mailbag, then opened the door. A single passenger stepped out. He was a man of indeterminate age, wearing a suit of gray wool that was dusty but well cut. He wore spectacles and carried a heavy leather satchel. He did not look like a cowboy, or a miner, or a rancher. He looked like a man who read ledgers for fun. He stood in the muddy street, looking around with a sharp, analytical gaze. He adjusted his glasses, then consulted a small notebook. Lucy and Eli were sitting on the porch of the boarding house. They had been waiting for this moment, hoping against hope that their letters had made it through. Eli stiffened. "That is him. How do you know?" "He walks like an officer," Eli said, "or a tax collector. He is looking for something." The stranger walked up the steps of the hotel and spoke to the clerk. A moment later, he turned and looked directly at the boarding house. From the window of his office across the street, Caleb Ward was also watching. He pulled back the curtain, his brow furrowed. He didn't know who the man was, but he knew the smell of trouble. And as he watched the stranger cross the street toward Eli and Lucy, Caleb felt the first cold prickle of fear he had felt in years. The investigator had arrived, and the storm was about to turn. Mr. Silas Harding was a man who moved with the precision of a Swiss clock in a world that ran on sun time and guesswork. He wore a suit of gray worsted wool that seemed impervious to the Montana dust, and he carried a leather satchel that contained the most dangerous weapon in the territory, a stack of blank ledger paper and a relentless commitment to arithmetic. For 3 days, Harding picked apart the town of Iron Creek. He did not bluster or threaten like Caleb Ward. He simply asked questions that had no easy answers. He sat in the saloon, sipping sarsaparilla while miners drank whiskey, and he asked about shift logs. He stood at the counter of the general store, asking about the price of timber supports in the year 1877. He visited the sheriff's office, asking to see the incident reports from the day of the collapse, noting with a raised eyebrow that the ink on the signatures looked remarkably fresh for documents that were supposed to be 2 years old. Eli and Lucy accompanied him to the mine. It was a cold, blustery Tuesday. The wind whistled through the gaps in the boarding that sealed the entrance, a sound like a low moan from the earth itself. Harding examined the seal. He ran his gloved hand over the wood. "This timber is new," he observed, his voice dry, "kept fresh to keep people out," Eli said, standing guard with his rifle, "or to keep the truth in." Harding adjusted his spectacles. He took a small pry bar from his bag. With surprising strength for a man of his build, he leveraged one of the boards loose. He peered into the darkness of the shaft, lighting a match to illuminate the first few yards of the tunnel. He knelt in the dirt, picking up a handful of rock debris. He crumbled it between his fingers. "Soft shale," he murmured, "and watermarks. High watermarks." He stood up, brushing the dust from his knees. He turned to Lucy. "Your husband, Mrs. Hale. He mentioned water. He said the walls were weeping," Lucy answered, her voice steady though her hands were cold. "He said the pumps could not keep up." Harding nodded, making a note in his book. Later that afternoon, they sat in the back room of the boarding house. A neutral ground, Mrs. Gable had grudgingly allowed them to use. Hank, the old miner, sat in the corner, twisting his hat in his hands. "Tell him what you told me." "Hank," Eli said gently. Hank repeated his story. He spoke of the crimson vein, of the rush to beat the claim filing, of the order to skip the support beams. Harding wrote it all down, his pen scratching loudly in the quiet room. When Hank finished, Harding looked up. "And the payment?" Harding asked. $50, Hank whispered. "Cash, handed to us by the sheriff." Harding reached into his satchel and pulled out a sheaf of papers he had obtained from the county clerk's office in Virginia City. "I have examined Mr. Ward's bank records," Harding said. 2 days after the collapse, a withdrawal was made for $500. That same day, the sheriff made a deposit of $100 into his personal account. The county surveyor, who signed off on the safety report without visiting the site, deposited $50. He looked at Eli and Lucy. "It is a trail of breadcrumbs," he said, "and it leads right to Mr. Ward's door." Caleb Ward felt the noose tightening before he even saw the rope. He had lived his life believing that money was a shield that could deflect any arrow. But Silas Harding was a man who did not seem to care about gold. Caleb tried to invite Harding to dinner at his ranch. Harding declined. Caleb sent a bottle of his finest bourbon to Harding's hotel room. Harding returned it unopened. Finally, Caleb cornered him in the hotel lobby. "You are a long way from home." "Mr. Harding," Caleb said, his voice low and menacing. "The territory can be a dangerous place for a man who asks too many questions. Accidents happen." Harding looked at him over the rim of his spectacles. "I have sent copies of my findings to the territorial governor and the attorney general. Mr. Ward, if I were to meet with an accident, those copies would become public record immediately. I suggest you save your threats for men who can be frightened by them." Caleb's face turned a mottled red. "You have nothing." "The testimony of a drunk and a hysterical widow? I have a hearing scheduled for tomorrow morning," Harding said calmly. "At the church, I suggest you attend." The Church of Iron Creek was a simple structure of white-painted pine, built to hold 100 souls. On the morning of the hearing, it held nearly 200. People packed into the pews, lined the walls, and crowded the vestibule. The air was thick with the smell of damp wool, sawdust, and nervous sweat. This was not a trial, not officially. It was a preliminary inquiry, but everyone knew that the verdict delivered here would be final in the eyes of the town. Lucy sat in the front pew, Eli beside her. She wore her gray dress, her hands folded in her lap to hide their trembling. Eli sat like a statue, his eyes scanning the room, his body tense. He was unarmed. Weapons had been prohibited inside the church, though he knew Caleb Ward played by his own rules. Harding stood at the pulpit, not preaching, but presenting facts. He laid out the ledger pages. He read the sworn affidavits from miners who had moved 3 towns over. He called Hank to the front. The old miner shook as he stood before the town, but he spoke the truth. He told them about the skipped beams. He told them about the bribe. A murmur went through the room. Neighbors looked at neighbors. The illusion of Caleb Ward as the benevolent patriarch began to crack. Then Harding turned to the congregation. "We have established that the mine was unsafe. We have established that Mr. Ward knew it. We have established that money changed hands to cover it up. This was not an act of God. It was an act of greed." Caleb Ward stood up. He was sitting in the third pew, surrounded by his ranch hands. He looked impeccable in a black suit, but his eyes were wild. "Lies!" he roared. The room went silent. "This is a conspiracy!" Caleb shouted, striding into the aisle. He pointed a shaking finger at the pulpit, then swung it toward Lucy and Eli. "Look at them!" he sneered. "The grieving widow and her paramour. Do you not see what this is? She is angry because I offered her charity and expected decency in return." He turned to the crowd, his voice dripping with venom. "She refused my proposal of marriage. Why? Because she prefers the bed of a drifter. She runs off into the storm, spends the night in a shack with a stranger, and then comes back here to destroy my good name to cover her own shame." He walked toward Lucy, towering over her. "You are not a victim. Lucinda, you are a hysterical, loose woman who seduced a cowboy and now wants to blame me for your husband's bad luck. You clung to him in that shack, didn't you? You let him touch you while your husband was barely cold in the ground." The townspeople whispered. The old prejudices, the rumors, the judgment. Caleb was fanning the embers, trying to turn the mob against her. Eli started to rise, his fists clenched, but Lucy put a hand on his arm. "No," she whispered. She stood up. She did not look down. She did not cry. She looked Caleb Ward in the eye, and then she turned to face the room. "Yes," she said. Her voice was not loud, but in the silence of the church, it carried to the rafters. "I clung to him," she said. A gasp rippled through the pews. "I clung to him because the wind was screaming like a banshee, and I was freezing to death." Lucy said, "I clung to him because I had fallen down a ravine, and I thought I was going to die alone in the dark." She looked at the women in the back. Mrs. Gable, the baker's wife, the women who had whispered about her. "I was terrified," she said. "I was human, and yes, he held me. He held me so I would not freeze. He held me so I would not lose my mind from the fear." She looked at Caleb. "He offered me safety. Caleb, you offered me a cage. You offered me a marriage that was just a way to silence a debt you created. You killed my husband to save 2 days of digging, and then you tried to buy me with the money you saved." She took a step toward him. "I am not ashamed of surviving, Mr. Ward, and I am not ashamed of the man who saved me. He is worth 10 of you, because he saved my life without asking for a thing in return. You took a life to fill your pockets." The truth of her words hung in the air, stark and undeniable. The shame that Caleb tried to cast on her evaporated, replaced by the clarity of her courage. People began to nod. "Mrs." Gable wiped a tear from her eye. The sheriff, standing by the door, looked down at his boots, unable to meet anyone's gaze. Caleb looked around the room. He saw the shift. He saw the respect in the eyes of the townspeople as they looked at Lucy, and the disgust as they looked at him. His power, built on fear and money, was dissolving. He panicked. He reached into his coat. "That is enough," he screamed. He drew a small pistol from a shoulder holster, a hideout gun he had smuggled in. He leveled it at Harding. "Stop this," he yelled. "I will not be ruined by a clerk and a whore." Panic erupted. Women screamed. Men dove behind pews. Eli moved. He did not hesitate. He launched himself from the pew, a blur of motion. He didn't go for a weapon he didn't have. He went for the man. He slammed into Caleb just as the gun fired. Bang! The shot went wild, shattering a window high above the altar. Shards of glass rained down like diamonds. Eli and Caleb crashed to the floor in the aisle. They rolled, grappling for the gun. Caleb was strong, fueled by desperation, but Eli was fighting for something more than survival. "Let go!" Caleb shrieked, striking at Eli's face with his free hand. Eli took the blow, ignoring the blood that split his lip. He gripped Caleb's wrist, twisting it back. "Drop it!" Eli roared. The gun was between them, a deadly piece of steel in the scramble of limbs. Bang! The second shot was muffled, fired at close range. The struggle stopped instantly. Caleb gasped, his eyes going wide. His grip on the gun loosened. He slumped back against the floorboards, a dark stain spreading rapidly across the white shirt beneath his coat. Eli scrambled back, breathing hard, his hands shaking. He stood up, looking down. Caleb was clutching his stomach, his face draining of color. The church was dead silent. Every eye was on Eli. He stood there, chest heaving, the adrenaline singing in his veins. He looked at Caleb, the man who had tormented Lucy, the man who had burned their home, the man who had killed Thomas. Caleb groaned, looking up at Eli with hate-filled eyes. "Finish it," he wheezed. "Go on. Prove you are the killer they say you are." Eli's hand hovered near his belt, where his own gun would have been. He looked at Lucy. She was standing in the pew, her hands over her mouth, her eyes wide with terror, not of Caleb, but of what Eli might do. "Do not make me lose another husband to this town." Eli looked at the bleeding man. He looked at Harding. He looked at the sheriff. He stepped back. He raised his empty hands in the air. "No!" Eli said. His voice was rough, but it was steady. He looked at the sheriff. "He is yours. Sheriff, justice is for the law to decide, not me." The sheriff, pale and shaking, stepped forward. He called for the doctor. 2 men rushed to help Caleb, who was still cursing weakly. Harding walked over to Eli. He placed a hand on Eli's shoulder. That was the right thing to do. "Son," Harding said quietly. Eli just looked at Lucy. She ran to him, ignoring the blood on his shirt, ignoring the crowd. She threw her arms around him, burying her face in his chest. "It is over," she sobbed. "It is over." Eli wrapped his arms around her, resting his chin on her hair. He closed his eyes. "Yes," he whispered. "It is done." Caleb Ward did not die on the church floor. He survived the gut shot, though he would never walk without a cane again. Harding arranged for his transport to the territorial capital within the week. He was charged with manslaughter, negligence, bribery, and attempted murder. The trial was swift. Without his money to buy silence, his empire crumbled. He was sentenced to 20 years in the territorial prison. The sheriff resigned the day after the shooting, slipping out of town before he could be charged as an accessory. A new man, a former Texas Ranger with a reputation for honesty, took the badge. Iron Creek began to change. The fear that had hung over the town like a storm cloud lifted. In the aftermath of the hearing, Lucy and Eli walked out of the church into the evening air. The sun was setting, painting the sky in strokes of violet and gold. The air was cold, crisp, and clean. People did not turn away. Mr. Henderson, the grocer who had cut off their credit, stepped off the boardwalk. He took off his hat. "Mr. Carter, Mrs. Hale," he said, his voice humble. I have some lumber in the yard, if you need it for the cabin. No charge, Mrs. Gable was waiting on the porch. She looked at Lucy's torn dress and Eli's bruised face. "I have a roast in the oven," she said stiffly. "It is too big for just the boarders. You had best come eat." It was not a parade. It was not a celebration. It was an acknowledgement. The town was offering a peace treaty. "Thank you," Lucy said. They did not marry immediately. They had the freedom now, but they chose to take the time that Caleb had tried to steal from them. They wanted to build a foundation before they built a roof. The rebuilding of the cabin became a community event. Men from the mine, feeling the weight of their own silence lifting, came on Sundays to help raise the walls. The grocer brought nails. The blacksmith forged new hinges. It was a better cabin this time. The logs were thicker. The windows were straight. There was a separate room for a bedroom, and a stout iron stove that Eli bought with wages he earned working honest shifts at the livery stable. As the structure rose, so did their life together. It was in the small moments that they truly fell in love. It wasn't the desperate clinging of the storm anymore. It was the quiet grace of ordinary days. They sat at their new rough-hewn table, eating stew by lamplight. "This is good," Eli said, wiping his mouth. "You put sage in it?" Lucy smiled. "It grows right outside the door. I thought we should use what the land gives us." She watched him across the table. The lines of tension around his eyes had softened. The scar was still there, a map of his past, but it no longer defined him. One afternoon, in the corral they had built, Eli put Lucy back on a horse. She was terrified at first, her hands shaking on the reins. "Trust the animal," Eli said, his hand on the bridle. "And trust yourself. You are stronger than you think." He walked beside her for an hour, talking her through the fear, until she was riding tall in the saddle, the wind in her hair, laughing for the first time in years. In the evenings, by the fire, the roles reversed. Lucy opened the new Bible she had bought. Thomas's was gone, and she had made peace with that. She sat close to Eli, the book spread across their knees. "Read this line," she said, pointing. Eli squinted, sounding out the words. "To everything, there is a season. Good," she said, resting her head on his shoulder, "and a time to every purpose under heaven." Eli kissed the top of her head. "I like that. A time to build, and a time to love," she whispered. They shared the bed in the new bedroom. It was a sturdy frame, with a mattress stuffed with fresh prairie grass that smelled of summer. They learned the geography of each other's bodies slowly, with reverence. The desperation of the line shack was gone, replaced by a deep, abiding tenderness. Lucy found that she could sleep without nightmares when Eli's arm was draped over her waist. She would wake in the middle of the night, feeling the steady rise and fall of his chest, and know that she was safe. Eli found that the ghosts of the war receded when he woke to the feeling of Lucy's hand on his cheek. He was no longer a weapon or a drifter. He was a husband. He was a builder. He was home. There were still some in town who judged them. There were still whispers from the rigid few who believed a widow should mourn forever. But Lucy didn't care. She walked through town with her head high, her arm linked through Eli's. She wore her wedding band, a simple gold ring Eli had hammered from a coin, like a badge of honor. They were a living testament to resilience. They were the couple who had walked through fire and come out holding hands. It was late November when the first true winter storm of the year rolled in. The sky turned a heavy, bruised purple in the afternoon. By twilight, the wind was howling, stripping the last dead leaves from the cottonwoods. Thunder, rare for the season, muttered in the distance, low and threatening. Inside the cabin, The lamp cast a warm, golden glows against the log walls. The stove was humming with heat. Lucy was standing by the window, looking out into the gathering dark. She saw the lightning flash on the horizon, illuminating the wild, unforgiving prairie. She felt a tremor of the old fear, the body memory of the cold, the pain, the loneliness. Her breath hitched. She felt Eli come up behind her. He didn't speak. He wrapped his strong arms around her waist, pulling her back against him. He rested his chin on her shoulder, his cheek pressing against hers. She leaned into him, feeling the solid wall of his chest. She could feel his heartbeat, slow and steady, a rhythm that countered the chaotic drumming of the rain. She placed her hands over his, lacing their fingers together. She looked at the reflection in the glass. Two people, merged into one shadow against the light. "It is a bad one," she whispered. Eli kissed her neck, right below her ear. "Let it blow," he said softly. "It cannot get in here." Lucy turned in his arms. She looked up at him. His dark eyes were full of warmth, reflecting the lamplight. "I am not afraid," she said, realizing it was true. "I remember that night in the shack. I remember thinking the wind would tear me apart." "It tried," Eli said, brushing a strand of hair from her forehead. "But you held on." "I held on to you," she said. She pressed her forehead against his. "Don't let go of me, Eli, not tonight." He tightened his embrace, holding her so close there was no space for the fear to exist between them. "I won't," he promised, his voice a vow as unbreakable as the iron stove. "Not tonight, not ever." Outside, the wind screamed and the thunder shook the earth. The storm raged with all the fury of the Wild West. But inside the cabin, glowing like a beacon in the vast darkness, two broken people held each other tight, their love a defiant, fragile, and enduring shelter that no storm could ever take away. Thank you for listening to this story. I hope you enjoyed the journey of Lucy and Eli as much as I enjoyed writing it. It is a tale about the storms we face, both in the sky and in our hearts, and the shelter we find in one another. I would love to hear from you. Please leave a comment below telling me where you are listening from. Are you in the American West, Europe, Asia? I am always fascinated to see how far these stories travel. If you enjoyed this Wild West romance, please consider subscribing to the channel From Wild West. I have many more stories to tell about the frontier, the people who lived there, and the loves that defied the odds. Share your thoughts in English in the comments. Did you like the ending? What would you like to hear next? Until next time, keep your fire lit and your door barred against the wind.